Dad. One word. 8 years of silence shattered in a single breath. Julian Crow, tech billionaire worth $4.7 billion, froze in the doorway of his mansion. His son, his permanently deaf son, had just spoken. And standing over Ethan with trembling hands was the housemaid he'd hired 3 months ago for $18 an hour. The medical miracle Julian had spent 8 years and $23 million chasing had just happened. Without his permission, without his knowledge, without a single doctor in the room. But as security rushed the hallway and Ethan's eyes filled with wonder at sounds he'd never heard, Julian faced a truth more devastating than any diagnosis. He'd been so busy buying solutions, he'd missed the only person actually paying attention. Stay with me until the end of this story. Like and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The December rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Crow estate like accusations, each drop a reminder of everything money couldn't control. Julian Crow stood in his home office, 73 floors worth of architectural arrogance perched on the edge of San Francisco Bay, and felt the weight of empire pressing down on his shoulders like wet concrete. Mr. Crow, I've reviewed Dr. Hauptmann's latest assessment. His assistant Patricia's voice crackled through the speakerphone, professionally neutral in that way that meant bad news was coming. He's recommending we discontinue the experimental treatments. Julian's jaw tightened. Dr. Emil Hauptmann was the 7th specialist they'd flown in this year. Before him, Dr. Chen from Singapore, Dr. Okafor from Johns Hopkins, Dr. Levinson from Tel Aviv. The parade of credentials had become almost performative, each consultation another scene in a play where Julian already knew the ending. Discontinue, Julian repeated, the word tasting like failure. That's what they all say when they've run out of ideas but want to keep cashing checks. Sir, with respect, Dr. Hauptmann didn't charge for this consultation. He said, and I'm quoting here, no amount of money will change what's been medically established. Your son's condition is permanent. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can focus on adaptation rather than cure. Julian ended the call without responding. Acceptance, adaptation. The vocabulary of surrender, dressed up as wisdom. He turned toward the windows, watching the storm darken the bay. 8 years. 8 years since the fever that had stolen his son's hearing overnight. Ethan had been 5 years old, small for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and her quiet curiosity about everything. Viral meningitis, the doctors had said. Catastrophic damage to both cochlear nerves. Irreversible. That word, irreversible. Julian had built his first company on the principle that nothing was irreversible. Crowtech had revolutionized data recovery, pulling lost information from supposedly destroyed hard drives, reconstructing deleted files from fragments of code that other companies declared unrecoverable. His entire fortune was built on proving experts wrong about what was permanent. But 8 years of specialists, experimental treatments, clinical trials in 3 countries, and $23 million later, his son still lived in absolute silence. The sound of the office door opening pulled Julian from his thoughts. His head of security, Marcus Webb, stepped inside with the careful posture of a man delivering news he knew wouldn't be well received. The background check came back on the new hire, Marcus said, extending a tablet. Lena Morales. Everything checked out clean. No criminal record, solid references from her previous employer. She worked for the Henderson family in Pacific Heights for 6 years before they relocated to Boston. Julian took the tablet, scanning the report with the same intensity he'd once applied to merger documents. 42 years old, originally from El Salvador, immigrated at 19. No college degree. Certified in basic first aid and CPR. Currently residing in the Tenderloin district, sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with her sister and niece. Why'd she leave the Henderson position? Julian asked. They moved. She chose to stay in San Francisco. Her mother's in a care facility here, St. Anne's, out in the Sunset. Advanced Alzheimer's. Marcus paused. The Henderson family tried to convince her to relocate with them, offered a significant raise. She turned it down. Something in that detail caught Julian's attention. In his experience, people who turned down money for principal were either fools or possessed something rarer than intelligence, integrity. He'd built an empire learning to tell the difference. When does she start? She's already here. Started this morning at 6. Mrs. Chen is showing her the routines. Julian nodded dismissal, but his mind was already elsewhere, cataloging this new variable in his carefully controlled household. The estate employed 14 people, 2 personal assistants, head of security plus 3 rotating guards, chef, chef's assistant, gardener, pool maintenance, driver, and now 3 housekeeping staff since Mrs. Chen had requested additional help with the square footage. He didn't know most of their names. That was Patricia's domain, hiring, managing, ensuring the machinery of his life ran smoothly while he focused on the machinery of his companies. It was efficient. It was how things worked. But efficiency, he'd learned, had its own kind of blindness. Lena Morales had cleaned a lot of houses in her 23 years of domestic work, but the Crow estate existed in a category beyond mere wealth. This wasn't money. This was architectural intimidation, every surface and angle designed to remind visitors that they existed on a different economic plane than the man who lived here. The West Wing is Mr. Crow's private office and business areas, Mrs. Chen was saying, her voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone who'd explained these same details too many times. She was a small woman, probably in her early 60s, with silver-threaded hair pulled back in a practical bun. You never enter unless specifically called. The East Wing contains the primary residence, guest suites, and— She paused, something shifting in her expression. Master Ethan's quarters. Mr. Crow's son, Lena said, keeping her voice neutral. She'd learned long ago that the best way to understand a household was to listen more than speak, to let the silences fill with information people didn't know they were sharing. Yes. Mrs. Chen's pace slowed as they approached a wide hallway lined with photographs. Master Ethan is 13. He's been deaf since he was 5 years old. He has his own nurse, his own tutor, his own schedule. Your duties don't include his areas unless his nurse, Miss Rodriguez, specifically requests assistance. Lena nodded, but her attention had already been caught by the photographs. They chronicled a life in reverse. The most recent images showed a thin teenager with dark, watchful eyes and the kind of careful stillness that came from spending too much time alone. But as the frames traveled backward through time, the boy changed, became younger, smaller, more present somehow. There was one photograph in particular, Ethan at maybe 4 or 5, laughing at something off camera, his whole face lit with uncomplicated joy. That was before, Mrs. Chen said quietly, noticing where Lena's gaze had landed. Before the fever, before the silence. Must be hard for his father, Lena observed carefully. Mrs. Chen's expression flickered with something complex. Sympathy mixed with something that looked almost like frustration. Mr. Crow loves his son, but he's a man who believes every problem has a solution if you throw enough money and expertise at it. He's brought in specialists from everywhere, experimental treatments, clinical trials. Nothing works. Nothing changes. And the boy? Master Ethan endures it all. The tests, the treatments, the parade of new doctors with new theories. He's very patient. Mrs. Chen turned away from the photographs. Too patient, maybe. Sometimes I think he's just waiting for everyone to realize what he already knows. That he's not broken. Just different. The word settled into Lena's chest with unexpected weight. She thought of her own mother, sitting in St. Anne's care facility, her mind steadily erased by Alzheimer's, until most days she didn't recognize her own daughter. The doctors had fancy terms for it, treatment plans that amounted to managed decline. But Maria Morales wasn't broken either, just traveling somewhere the rest of them couldn't follow yet. The master suite is through here, Mrs. Chen continued, professional mask sliding back into place. You'll handle these rooms Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Mr. Crow is particular about his privacy, so you'll work when he's at the office or traveling. His bedroom, his bathroom, his walk-in closet, and dressing area. Everything should be immaculate but untouched. Don't reorganize anything. Don't move anything except to clean it. They moved through rooms that felt more like museum exhibits than living spaces. Everything was expensive, carefully chosen, perfectly maintained, and utterly impersonal. The bedroom could have belonged to anyone. No photographs on the nightstand, no books on the shelf that looked like they'd been read rather than arranged. just surfaces and objects, wealth converted into physical form, but somehow empty of actual life. "You'll find Mr. Crow is fair but exacting," Mrs. Chen said as they completed the tour. "He pays well, better than market rate. The benefits are excellent. In return, he expects precision, discretion, and boundaries. Don't ask personal questions, don't engage in gossip with the other staff. Don't try to become friendly with him or Master Ethan. This is a professional environment, and Mr. Crow values it staying that way." Lena had heard versions of this speech before. Rich people bought service the same way they bought furniture. They wanted quality, consistency, and for it to remain in its designated place. She understood the rules. She'd played by them for decades. But as Mrs. Chen walked her back toward the service areas, Lena found herself thinking about that photograph of young Ethan, the one from before. The joy in his face had been so complete, so unshadowed by the weight of expensive expectations. She wondered if anyone in this pristine, carefully managed house ever asked what the boy actually needed versus what his father's money was trying to buy him. Ethan Crow had learned to read the world through vibrations and shadows, the shift of light across faces, the micro-expressions that most people never noticed because they were too busy listening to words. Sound had been gone so long he sometimes struggled to remember what his mother's voice had sounded like, though he could perfectly recall the way her face had softened when she sang to him. She'd died 6 years ago. Car accident on Highway 101, black ice and wrong place, wrong time. After that, it was just him and his father, and an ever-expanding team of people paid to care for him while Julian built empires and dismantled problems with the same ruthless efficiency. His bedroom was a teenager's dream, at least on paper. Custom gaming setup with monitors that displayed visual feedback for games designed for hearing players. A wall of books he'd read 3 times over. Art supplies he used to sketch the world as he experienced it. All texture and movement, no sound. A view of the bay that changed every day. Infinite variations of water and light. But dreams, Ethan had learned, could be very lonely places. He sat at his desk now, working through the calculus homework Mr. Brennan had assigned. His tutor was excellent, patient, clear, never treating Ethan's deafness like an intellectual limitation. But there was something exhausting about being constantly educated, constantly improved, constantly the subject of some new intervention designed to optimize his life. The overhead light flickered slightly, the signal from Ms. Rodriguez that someone was approaching. His nurse had installed the system when he was 7, a simple way to alert him without startling him. Ethan looked up as his door opened. His father stood in the doorway, still wearing his work clothes, tie loosened but not removed. Julian Crow at home versus Julian Crow in the world were essentially the same person, controlled, purposeful, always calculating the next move. He rarely knocked, Ethan noticed, just entered, as if knocking required an acknowledgement of boundaries he didn't recognize in his own house. Julian moved his hands in the sign language they'd both learned, though his signing had always been stiff, mechanical. "How was your day?" "Fine," Ethan signed back. It was his standard answer, the one that required no follow-up. Dr. Hauptmann sent his final report. "He's recommending we discontinue the treatments." Something that might have been relief flickered through Ethan's chest, but he kept his face neutral. The treatments had been exhausting. Medications that made him nauseous, therapies that accomplished nothing except proving what he already knew. He was deaf. It wasn't changing. No amount of his father's money or determination would alter that fact. "Okay," he signed. Julian's jaw tightened, a tell Ethan knew well. His father hated acceptance, hated surrender. The man had built everything on the principle that obstacles were just problems that hadn't been properly solved yet. "There's a new specialist in Switzerland," Julian signed. "Pioneering work with nerve regeneration. I've reached out to his team." "Dad." Ethan's hands moved with a firmness that surprised them both. "I'm fine. I don't need to be fixed." "You're not broken," Julian signed quickly, almost defensively. "But if there's a chance..." "There isn't." Ethan held his father's gaze. "And I'm tired of being your next problem to solve." The words, or rather, the signs, hung between them like a challenge. Julian's expression went through several shifts: frustration, hurt, something that might have been recognition before the walls came back up. "I'm trying to help you," Julian finally signed. I know, Ethan responded, and that was the terrible truth of it. He did know. His father loved him. Julian just didn't know how to love something he couldn't control, couldn't improve, couldn't bend to his will through sheer force of resources and determination. Julian stood there a moment longer, then nodded curtly and left, closing the door with the careful precision of a man who never slammed doors because it implied lost control. Ethan turned back to his calculus, but the numbers blurred on the page. He thought about what he'd signed. I'm tired of being your next problem to solve, and recognized the truth in it. He wasn't a person to his father, not really. He was a project, a challenge. The one thing Julian Crow's money and brilliance couldn't fix, which meant he'd never stop trying. The light flickered again. Ethan looked up to see Ms. Rodriguez in the doorway, signing a question. Everything okay? He nodded, managed what he hoped was a reassuring smile, and returned to his homework. But the feeling lingered, that bone-deep exhaustion of being constantly measured against some impossible standard of wholeness, as if his current existence was just a temporary state waiting to be corrected. Sometimes Ethan wondered what would happen if he could make his father understand. He didn't want to be fixed. He just wanted to be seen. Lena's first week at the Crow estate passed in a careful routine of learning the patterns of the house and its inhabitants. She worked the early shift, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., Monday through Friday, which meant she witnessed the morning choreography of wealth. Julian leaving precisely at 7:30, driver holding the door of the black Mercedes. Miss Rodriguez arriving at 8 with Ethan's breakfast on a tray. Mr. Brennan, the tutor, coming at 9:30, departing at 3. The house had a rhythm, and Lena learned it the way she'd learned every house before this one, by paying attention to what people did rather than what they said. She noticed that Julian never ate breakfast at home, that Ethan's nurse handled his meals with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped asking if he had preferences, that the chef prepared elaborate dinners that usually went mostly uneaten. But she also noticed things that seemed to live in the spaces between the official routines. On her 4th day while cleaning the hallway outside Ethan's suite, she saw him through the partially open door. He was sitting at his desk, hunched over in a way that made her own back ache in sympathy. But it wasn't his posture that caught her attention. It was the way his right hand kept rising to his ear, pressing against it with the heel of his palm before dropping back to his homework. The gesture was brief, almost furtive, like he was trying to hide it even from himself. Lena filed the observation away and continued her work. Not her business, not her place to notice. On day 6, she saw it again. This time, Ethan was in the hallway, heading toward the library, and the movement was more pronounced, his whole body tensing, hand going to his ear, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face before he caught himself and kept walking. On day 8, she found him in the media room, curled on the couch with a book, and the gesture had become almost constant. Press, release, press, release. His face had gone pale, a light sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the house's perfect climate control. Something was wrong. Lena set down her cleaning supplies and moved closer, careful to make sure he could see her approaching. When Ethan looked up, she could see the pain in his eyes. Not just physical discomfort, but the exhaustion of trying to hide it. She pulled out her phone, typed quickly, "Are you okay? You keep touching your ear." Ethan's expression flickered with something like surprise that she'd noticed, followed by the automatic deflection of a kid who'd learned not to complain. He reached for his own phone, typed back, "It's fine. Just a headache." "When did it start?" He hesitated, then typed, "A few days ago. It comes and goes. Have you told your nurse?" Another hesitation, longer this time, then, "She'll tell my dad. He'll bring in more doctors, more tests. I'm tired of tests." The words appeared on the screen with a weight that told Lena everything she needed to know about this boy's life. He was 13 years old and already so weary of being examined, evaluated, treated like a medical mystery rather than a person, that he'd rather suffer in silence than invite another round of expensive interventions. Lena thought about the specialists Mrs. Chen had mentioned, the experimental treatments, the parade of solutions that never solved anything. She thought about her mother at St. Anne's, surrounded by care that was technically excellent, but somehow missed the essential fact of who Maria Morales actually was. She typed carefully, "Can I look?" I won't tell anyone unless you want me to. I just want to see if there's something simple going on. Ethan studied her face for a long moment, and Lena had the sense of being evaluated with an intelligence that had learned to read people in the absence of words. Finally, he nodded. Lena moved closer, pulled out her phone's flashlight. "Tilt your head toward the light," she typed, and Ethan complied. She'd learned basic health assessment during her certification classes years ago, back when she'd thought she might go into nursing before life and bills had redirected her path. She knew how to check for obvious problems: infection signs, inflammation, foreign objects. It was probably nothing. Kids got ear infections, headaches, mysterious pains that came and went. But as Lena peered into Ethan's right ear, her breath caught. There, visible even to her untrained eye, was something that definitely didn't belong. Dark, lodged deep, but not impossibly so, pressing against the canal in a way that would absolutely cause pain and pressure. She pulled back, typed quickly. "When was the last time a doctor looked in your ears?" Ethan frowned, thinking. "I don't know, years maybe? They're always focused on the nerves, the cochlear damage. The deafness itself. There's something in there," Lena typed. "Something blocking the canal. It could be causing the pain." Ethan's eyes widened. "What is it?" "I don't know, but it needs to come out." She watched conflict play across his face, fear of more doctors warring with the practical reality of increasing pain. Finally, he typed, "Can you remove it?" Lena's finger hovered over the keyboard. This was the moment where she should step back, defer to the professional, stay in her lane. She was a housekeeper, not a medical provider. If something went wrong, she could be fired, sued, worse. But she thought about that gesture she'd been watching for days, Ethan's hand going to his ear over and over, trying to relieve pressure that no one else had noticed because they were all too busy looking at bigger, more expensive problems. "Let me get some supplies," she typed. "If I can't get it easily, we tell your nurse. Deal?" Ethan nodded, something like relief washing over his features. Lena went to the supply closet where she kept her own first aid kit. She'd learned long ago that cleaning often came with minor injuries, and it was easier to handle them herself than make a fuss. She returned with a small flashlight, tweezers, cotton swabs, and antiseptic. "This might feel weird, but it shouldn't hurt," she typed. "If it hurts, I stop immediately. Okay?" "Okay." Lena positioned herself carefully, angling the light to get the best view. The object was definitely there, dark and foreign against the pink tissue of the ear canal. She could see why it had been missed. Doctors checking for nerve damage wouldn't necessarily be looking for something this simple, this mechanical. She worked slowly, carefully, using the tweezers with the precision she'd learned from 20 years of detail work. The object shifted slightly and Ethan tensed. "Still okay?" she typed with one hand. He nodded, jaw tight. She tried again, adjusting her angle, working by feel as much as sight. The tweezers caught the edge of something, held. Lena applied gentle, steady pressure, easing the object toward the opening of the canal. It resisted, then suddenly gave way. The object came free in one smooth motion, a small dark bead, about the size of a pea, coated in earwax and debris. It must have been there for years, Lena realized, pushing deeper, creating pressure, causing pain that Ethan had probably learned to live with because no one was looking for something this simple. She held it up to show him, then typed, "Got it. How does it feel?" Ethan's hand rose automatically to his ear, then stopped. His expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, then something that might have been wonder. He grabbed his phone, typed frantically. "It feels different. The pressure is gone. But there's something else, something weird." "Weird how?" Ethan stood abruptly, moving toward his desk. He picked up a pen, dropped it. Picked up a book, set it down. His movements were jerky, almost panicked, and Lena felt her own heart rate spike. Had she hurt him? Damaged something? Then Ethan turned to face her, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked like terror and joy competing for space on his 13-year-old face. He typed 3 words, hands shaking. "I hear that." Lena stared at the screen, her brain refusing to process what she was reading. It wasn't possible. The doctors had been clear: nerve damage, permanent, irreversible. She'd removed a blockage, nothing more, a simple object causing simple pressure. But Ethan was moving around the room now, touching everything, dropping objects, his whole body vibrating with something that transcended language. He picked up a book, let it fall to the floor. The sound he could apparently hear, made him gasp. He turned back to Lena, typed with fingers that could barely hit the right keys. It's muffled, distant, but it's there. Sound. I can hear sound. I can hear? The room seemed to tilt sideways. Lena reached for the edge of the desk to steady herself, her mind racing through implications she couldn't begin to process. 8 years of silence, $23 million in specialists and treatments. And it had been, what? A bead? A childhood toy lodged so deep that no one thought to look because they were too busy chasing expensive solutions? We need to tell someone, she typed, though her hands were shaking now too. Your nurse, your father, a doctor who can check that this is real, that you're okay. But even as she typed it, even as professional instinct screamed at her to escalate this to the actual medical professionals, she could see Ethan's expression changing. The wonder was still there, but now it was mixing with something else. Fear, understanding. He typed slowly. My father. He's going to want to know everything. How it happened. Why no one found it before. He's going to... The sentence broke off, but Lena understood what he couldn't type. Julian Crow was going to have questions. Hard questions. About how a housekeeper with no medical training had accomplished what $23 million worth of specialists had missed. About who was responsible, who had failed, who needed to be held accountable. And Lena, holding tweezers in one hand and a small plastic bead in the other, was going to be standing at the center of all those questions. Do you want to wait? She typed. Think about this before we tell anyone. Ethan shook his head violently, typed with sudden urgency. No, I need to know if this is real, if it's permanent, if... He stopped, started again. I need to know if I can actually hear my father's voice when he comes home tonight. The words hit Lena square in the chest. This boy, who'd spent 8 years in silence, who'd endured treatment after treatment, who'd learned to live in a world where sound was just a memory. He wanted to hear his father. Okay, Lena typed. We'll tell Ms. Rodriguez when she comes back from lunch. She can call your father, arrange for a doctor to check you properly. But Ethan... She paused, making sure he was reading carefully. This might not be what it seems. The object was causing pressure, and removing it might have created a temporary sensation. A real doctor needs to verify what's actually happening. Ethan nodded, but Lena could see it in his eyes. He was already past caution, past careful medical verification. He was listening to the world, and the world was finally talking back. They sat together in the media room, surrounded by expensive silence and impossible sound, and waited for everything to change. Bisht. Ms. Rodriguez returned from lunch at 1:15 to find Ethan and Lena sitting in the hallway outside his suite, the boy's eyes bright with something that made her professional instincts immediately spike to high alert. What's wrong? She asked, her hands already moving through sign language even as she spoke. Lena stood, her own Spanish accent thickening slightly under stress. Something happened. Something important. Ethan needs to tell you, or show you, himself. The nurse's gaze flicked between them, then settled on Ethan with the intensity of someone trained to spot medical emergencies. She signed quickly. Are you hurt? In pain? Ethan shook his head, pulled out his phone, showed her what he'd typed. Drop your keys on the floor. Ms. Rodriguez's eyebrows rose. What? Please, just drop your keys. The nurse complied, more from confusion than understanding. The keys hit the marble floor with a sharp metallic jangle that echoed through the hallway. Ethan's entire body jerked at the sound, a huge smile breaking across his face. He pointed to the keys, then to his right ear, then typed frantically. I heard that. I actually heard it. Ms. Rodriguez went very still. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, the tone of medical professionals everywhere who'd learned not to trust miracles until proven otherwise. Ethan, sweetheart, that's not possible. Your cochlear nerves... There was something in his ear, Lena interrupted. A blockage. I removed it. And now he says he can hear. The nurse's attention snapped to Lena with laser focus. You removed something from his ear? You're not medical personnel. Why didn't you... He was in pain, Lena said quietly. He's been in pain for days. pressing his hand to his ear, and no one noticed. I noticed, and I looked, and there was a bead lodged deep, and I removed it. That's all. That's all? Ms. Rodriguez's voice rose slightly. You performed a medical procedure on a patient, a child, without authorization, without... I can hear you arguing, Ethan interrupted, his voice rough from years of disuse but unmistakable. Both women froze. The words hung in the air like physical objects. Miss Rodriguez's face drained of color. Lena felt her legs go weak. Say that again, the nurse whispered. I can hear you. Ethan's pronunciation was uncertain, shaped by muscle memory from 8 years ago, but the words were clear enough. It's muffled, like I'm underwater, but it's there. Sound is there. Miss Rodriguez pulled out her phone with shaking hands, already dialing. Mr. Crow? Sir, I need you to come home immediately. There's been... She paused, struggling for words. There's been a development with Ethan. Medical, but positive, I think. Sir, please, just come home. She ended the call, turned back to Ethan, her professional mask cracking around the edges. We need to get you to a hospital, right now. Full examination. This shouldn't be possible. But if it is... No hospital, came a voice from the end of the hallway. All three of them turned to see Julian Crow striding toward them, his suit jacket forgotten, tie loosened, phone still in his hand. He must have run every red light between his office and the estate. Dad, Ethan said, and the single word, spoken, not signed, stopped Julian in his tracks like he'd hit an invisible wall. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other across the marble hallway, and Lena watched Julian Crow's face go through an entire emotional revolution. Shock, disbelief, wonder. And then, crashing through everything else, a kind of devastation that came from understanding what he'd spent 8 years missing. How? Julian's voice barely rose above a whisper. Miss Rodriguez stepped forward. Sir, it appears there was a foreign object lodged in Ethan's right ear canal. Miss Morales removed it, and Ethan is now reporting auditory sensation. But we need proper medical evaluation to understand Ms. Morales. Julian's gaze swung to Lena, and she felt the full weight of a billionaire's attention like a physical force. You removed something from my son's ear. It wasn't a question. Lena lifted her chin, met his eyes. Yes, sir. A small bead. It was causing him pain, and you're qualified to make that determination? To perform that procedure? No, sir. But I noticed he was hurting, and I looked, and it was there, clear as day, so I removed it. The hallway went silent except for the sound of rain against windows. Lena could feel her entire future balanced on whatever came next. This man could destroy her life with a phone call, have her arrested for medical malpractice, ensure she never worked again. But then Julian turned back to his son, and something in his expression shifted. Ethan, can you really hear me? Yes, Ethan said, the words soft but certain. Not perfectly, but yes. Julian moved closer, knelt down so they were eye level. What does my voice sound like? Ethan's face scrunched in concentration. Like I'm hearing it through water, or from far away. But it's your voice. I recognize it from before, from when I was little. Something broke in Julian's expression then, some final wall crumbling. He pulled his son into a fierce embrace, and over Ethan's shoulder, his eyes found Lena's. We need to call Dr. Hauptmann, he said, his voice thick, and Chen, and every specialist who told me this was impossible, because apparently, he pulled back, hands on Ethan's shoulders, they were all wrong. Or they were all looking in the wrong place, Lena said quietly. Julian's jaw tightened. Meaning they were focused on expensive problems, neural damage, irreversible conditions. They weren't looking for something simple. Something that's probably been there since before the meningitis, making everything worse, blocking the tiny bit of hearing he might have had left. They saw what they expected to see. The words hung in the air, an accusation and a truth that made Julian Crow stand very still. Get him to the hospital, he said finally, to Miss Rodriguez. Full workup, audiology, ENT, everything. I want to know exactly what happened, what changed, what his actual hearing capacity is. He turned to Lena. You're coming too. The doctors will need to know exactly what you removed and how. Sir, you have nothing more important than this, Julian cut her off. Whatever you did, whatever you found, it's either going to be the answer to 8 years of hell, or it's... He stopped, seeming to realize what he was about to say. Just come, please. The please, Lena noticed, seemed to cost him something. An hour later, they were at San Francisco General's emergency department. Ethan surrounded by doctors with instruments and questions and barely contained excitement. The head of audiology, Dr. Sarah Michaels, had been called in personally by Julian's assistant, arriving in workout clothes because she'd been at the gym when the summons came. This is extraordinary, she kept saying, examining Ethan's right ear with an otoscope while 3 other specialists crowded around. There's significant scarring from where the object was lodged, probably for years. It created pressure on the tympanic membrane and the remaining neural tissue. Combined with the damage from the meningitis, can he hear or not? Julian interrupted, standing against the wall with his arms crossed, watching everything with the intensity of a man who'd built empires on understanding every detail. Dr. Michaels pulled back, her expression cautious. He can hear. The right ear has approximately 30% hearing capacity, which, given the extent of the original neural damage, is a miracle. The left ear remains completely deaf, as expected, but that 30% in the right ear combined with proper hearing aids and therapy could give him functional hearing. The room went silent. Functional hearing. After 8 years of specialists saying it was impossible, after $23 million in treatments, after Julian Crow had moved heaven and earth trying to buy his son a miracle, it had been hiding behind a plastic bead the size of a pea. How, Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet, did every specialist I brought in miss this? Dr. Michaels had the grace to look uncomfortable. The blockage was deep, and if the focus was on neural damage evaluation, audiological testing, experimental treatments, a simple visual examination of the ear canal might have been considered redundant, especially if there was no reported pain or... There was pain, Lena spoke up from her corner of the room. He kept pressing his hand to his ear, over and over. I saw it for days. Every eye in the room turned to her. Dr. Michaels frowned. The reports in his file make no mention of ear pain. Because I didn't tell anyone, Ethan said quietly, his voice still rough and uncertain. I was tired of doctors, tired of tests. I dealt with it. Julian's face had gone through several shades of pale. You were in pain for days, and you didn't say anything. Would it have mattered? Ethan met his father's eyes. You would have brought in more specialists, more treatments. I just wanted it to stop, all of it. The words landed like grenades in the sterile hospital room. Lena watched Julian Crow, tech billionaire, problem solver, man who'd never met an obstacle he couldn't overcome through sheer force of will and resources, confront the reality that his determination to fix his son had blinded him to actually seeing him. We'll need to do comprehensive audiological mapping, Dr. Michaels said, breaking the terrible silence. Determine the exact range of his hearing, fit him for appropriate aids, start speech therapy to help him relearn verbal communication. This is going to be a long process, Mr. Crow. Managing expectations is crucial. He's not going to have normal hearing. He's going to have more than he had yesterday, Julian said, his voice rough. That's enough. But Lena could see it in his eyes. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough for a man who'd spent 8 years trying to will reality into submission. Ms. Morales, Dr. Michaels turned to Lena. I'd like to examine what you removed from the ear canal. Do you still have it? Lena reached into her pocket, pulled out the small plastic bead she'd wrapped carefully in a tissue. Dr. Michaels took it with gloved hands, examining it under a light. How did you know to look for this? I noticed he was in pain, Lena said simply. I've worked as a housekeeper for 23 years. You learn to notice when something's wrong, even when people try to hide it. And I have basic first aid training. I know what a blocked ear canal looks like. But you're not a medical professional. No, I'm someone who pays attention. Lena held the doctor's gaze. Is that a crime? Dr. Michaels glanced at Julian, then back to Lena. That depends on what the lawyers decide. Technically, you performed a medical procedure without license or authorization. On a minor. Even if the outcome was positive, Are you seriously suggesting we should pursue legal action against the person who did what millions of dollars couldn't? Julian's voice cut through the room like a blade. The woman who actually helped my son? I'm suggesting there are liability issues to consider, Mr. Crow. If something had gone wrong, but it didn't, Ethan interrupted. She helped me. She's the only one who noticed I was hurting, the only one who bothered to actually look at me instead of my medical file. The words silenced the room again. Lena saw Julian flinch, saw the hit land exactly where Ethan had aimed it. Dr. Michaels cleared her throat. Well, regardless of the circumstances, we need to move forward with proper care. Ethan, I'd like to admit you overnight for observation and additional testing. Mr. Crow, my office will coordinate with your insurance for— Money isn't an issue, Julian said automatically, then stopped, something shifting in his expression. Actually, Dr. Michaels, I want a full review of every specialist I've brought in for Ethan over the past 8 years. Every treatment plan, every examination, every report. I want to know who looked at his ears and when. I want to know how this was missed. Sir, I don't think— I'm not asking. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Dr. Michaels nodded stiffly, made a note on her tablet, and began coordinating with her team. Lena watched it all unfold. The machinery of expensive medicine kicking into gear, the specialists and equipment and protocols that would now surround Ethan in the name of maximizing his newly discovered 30% hearing. It was necessary, she supposed, but part of her worried that in the rush to optimize and improve and provide the best possible care, they'd miss the simple truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Sometimes the most important thing wasn't having the most expensive solution. Sometimes it was just having someone who actually noticed you were hurting. Julian approached her as the medical team swept Ethan away for more tests, his expression unreadable. Miss Morales, a word. Lena's stomach tightened. Here it came, the lawsuit, the firing, the consequences of stepping outside her designated role. But when Julian spoke, his voice was quiet, almost uncertain. What you did. I need to understand. You said you noticed he was in pain, for days. Yes. And in all that time, with the nurse checking on him daily, with me seeing him every evening, with tutors and staff, no one else noticed. It wasn't a question, but Lena answered anyway. I don't know what other people noticed, Mr. Crow. I just know what I saw. Which was what, exactly? Lena met his eyes. I saw a boy who'd learned not to complain because complaints led to more interventions, more tests, more people treating him like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be heard. I saw someone who'd rather suffer in silence than invite more of the kind of help that never actually helped. Julian's jaw worked. You think that's my fault? I think you love your son. I think you've tried everything you know how to try. I also think— She paused, weighing her words carefully. That sometimes love looks like listening instead of fixing, noticing instead of solving. The words landed, and Lena watched Julian Crow, who'd built an empire on solving impossible problems, struggle with the possibility that his strength had become his greatest weakness when it came to his own child. I owe you, he said finally. More than I can repay. You gave my son something I've been trying to buy for 8 years. I removed a bead from his ear, Lena corrected. Everything else, the hearing, the speech therapy, the audiological work, that's still ahead. And it's going to be hard. Harder than you think, maybe. Because 30% hearing isn't the same as being hearing. He's still going to be deaf in most contexts. Still going to be different. But he can hear my voice, Julian said, and for the first time since Lena had met him, she heard something like vulnerability in his tone. After 8 years, he can hear his father's voice. Then maybe, Lena said gently, the question isn't what else you can fix. Maybe it's what you want to say to him now that he can hear you. Julian stood very still, that question hanging in the sterile hospital corridor like a challenge he'd spent years not considering. Before he could respond, Dr. Michaels emerged from the examination room. Mr. Crow, we'd like your consent for some additional imaging. There are questions about the extent of the neural recovery that— Julian turned to handle the next immediate crisis, falling back into the comfortable role of problem solver, decision maker, man in control. But before he walked away, He glanced back at Lena, and in that look she saw something that might have been understanding. Or maybe just the beginning of it. The hospital kept Ethan overnight, running tests that stretched into the following afternoon. Lena had expected to be dismissed once the medical professionals took over, sent back to her designated role of cleaning floors and maintaining boundaries. Instead, Julian had asked her to stay, not ordered, she noticed, but asked, in case the doctors had questions about the extraction procedure. She sat in the waiting area outside Ethan's room, watching the parade of specialists come and go, each one emerging with expressions that ranged from baffled to fascinated. Around 2 in the afternoon, a woman in an expensive suit arrived, carrying a briefcase that screamed legal representation. She went directly to Julian, spoke to him in low tones for several minutes, then turned and walked straight toward Lena. "Miss Morales? I'm Catherine Chen, Mr. Crow's attorney. I need to ask you some questions about yesterday's incident." Incident. That's what they were calling it. Lena set down the lukewarm coffee she'd been nursing and met the lawyer's eyes. "Am I being charged with something?" "That depends entirely on your answers." Catherine settled into the chair beside her, pulling out a tablet. "Walk me through exactly what happened. Start with when you first noticed something was wrong." Lena recounted the story she'd already told 3 times to various doctors. The hand-pressing gesture, the visible pain, Ethan's reluctance to involve more medical professionals, her decision to look, what she'd found, how she'd removed it. Catherine listened without interrupting, her stylus moving across the tablet screen in quick, efficient strokes. "And you're aware that performing medical procedures without a license is illegal in California?" "I removed a bead from a child's ear," Lena said evenly. "Parents do that for their kids every day. I didn't perform surgery. I didn't prescribe medication. I looked, saw something that didn't belong, and took it out. If that's illegal, then charge me." Catherine's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been respect. "Mr. Crow isn't interested in charging you with anything, Miss Morales, but there are other considerations. Liability issues. The fact that multiple specialists over 8 years failed to identify this blockage raises questions about medical malpractice. If litigation proceeds, you'll likely be called as a witness. Your testimony could be," she paused, choosing words carefully, "uncomfortable for some very expensive doctors." "Good," Lena said. "Excuse me?" I said good. Those doctors took millions of dollars and years of that boy's life chasing complicated answers while missing something simple. If they're uncomfortable being held accountable, that's their problem, not mine. Catherine studied her for a long moment. "Mr. Crow is considering establishing a medical review board to investigate what happened. He'll need your cooperation for that process. He's also," she glanced at her tablet, "interested in ensuring you're appropriately compensated for your role in Ethan's recovery." "I don't want his money." "Ms. Morales, I did what anyone should have done. I noticed a child in pain, and I helped him. That's not something that deserves a reward. It's just basic human decency." The lawyer's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something that looked almost like surprise. "Most people in your position would be negotiating for a settlement, especially given that you could make a case for wrongful termination if Mr. Crow decides your employment is too complicated to continue." The words landed with the weight of reality Lena had been avoiding. Of course her job was over. Rich men didn't keep housekeepers around who'd exposed the failures of their expensive specialists, who'd witnessed their vulnerability, who'd stepped so far outside their designated roles. "I understand," Lena said quietly. "I'll submit my resignation effective immediately." "Actually," came Julian's voice from behind them, "I'd prefer if you stayed." Both women turned. Julian stood in the hallway, still wearing yesterday's clothes, exhaustion written across his face. He'd been at the hospital all night, Lena knew, refusing to leave even when Ethan had been settled and sleeping. Catherine stood smoothly. "Mr. Crow, I was just explaining the situation to Ms. Morales." "I heard." Julian's gaze remained fixed on Lena. "And I'm telling you both that Ms. Morales' employment continues. In fact," he paused, something shifting in his expression, "I'd like to discuss expanding her role." Lena blinked. "Sir?" "Ethan trusts you. That's—" Julian's voice roughened slightly. "That's rare." He spent 8 years surrounded by medical professionals, therapists, specialists, people paid to care for him. You're the first person in a long time who noticed him as a person rather than a patient. I'd be a fool to let that go. Mr. Crow, Catherine interjected carefully, we should discuss the liability implications. Then discuss them and find solutions. That's what I pay you for. Julian's tone carried the unmistakable edge of a man accustomed to having his decisions enacted, not questioned. Ms. Morales, I know this goes beyond your original job description. If you're not interested, I understand. But I'm asking you to consider staying on in a capacity that includes, he struggled for the right words, continuing to pay attention, to notice things, to be someone Ethan can trust. You're asking me to be what? Exactly. A nanny? A nurse? I'm asking you to be what you already are. Someone who sees him. Julian's exhaustion was showing now, the carefully maintained control starting to crack. Look, I don't have a title for it. I don't have a job description. I just know that you did in 4 days what an army of specialists couldn't do in 8 years. You noticed. You cared enough to act. And my son is hearing sounds right now because of it. Lena looked between Julian and his lawyer, weighing the offer against everything she knew about how these situations typically played out. Rich families didn't invite housekeepers into their inner circles. This would end badly. She'd overstep some invisible boundary, or Ethan would recover and no longer need her, or Julian would realize how uncomfortable it was having someone around who'd witnessed his failure. But then she thought about Ethan's face yesterday when he'd first heard sound, the pure wonder in his expression. The way he'd typed, I can hear my father's voice with hands that shook from excitement and fear and hope all tangled together. I'll stay, she said, but not for more money. You pay me what the position is worth for housekeeping, nothing extra. I'm not comfortable with anything that looks like I'm being compensated for medical care I'm not qualified to provide. Julian's jaw tightened. Ms. Morales? Those are my terms, Mr. Crow. If you want someone around your son who isn't there because of what you're paying them, that's how it has to be. A long silence stretched between them. Catherine looked like she wanted to object on multiple professional grounds. Julian studied Lena's face with an intensity that felt like being X-rayed. All right, he said finally. We'll do it your way, but Catherine will draw up proper documentation, liability waivers, role definitions, emergency protocols. If you're going to be around Ethan in any caregiving capacity, even informally, it needs to be legally protected. Understood. Good. Julian turned toward Ethan's room, then paused. They're releasing him in about an hour. Dr. Michaels wants to see him weekly for audiology appointments. There's going to be speech therapy, hearing aid fittings, a lot of adjustment. It's going to be... His voice caught slightly. It's going to be overwhelming for him. Then maybe, Lena said gently, the question is how to make it less overwhelming. How to let him process this at his own pace, instead of rushing him through another round of intensive interventions. Julian's shoulders tensed. You think I should just let him figure it out on his own? Do nothing? I think there's a middle ground between doing nothing and doing everything. I think maybe you could ask Ethan what he wants, what he needs, instead of deciding for him. The words hung in the hospital corridor like a challenge. Catherine had gone very still, clearly recognizing dangerous territory. Julian's expression cycled through several emotions before landing somewhere between anger and something that looked almost like grief. I've spent 8 years trying to fix him, Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. And the whole time, he didn't need fixing. He needed someone to notice he was in pain and just... He stopped, the sentence trailing into silence. He needed someone to see him, Lena finished quietly. Not the deafness, not the medical file, just him. Julian nodded once, sharp and abrupt, then walked away before either woman could see if the moisture in his eyes was exhaustion or something deeper. Catherine waited until he disappeared into Ethan's room before turning to Lena. That was either very brave or very foolish, Miss Morales. Probably both, Lena admitted. But someone needs to say it. That man loves his son, but he's loved him the wrong way for so long, I'm not sure he knows how to stop. And you think you can teach a billionaire how to be a better father? I think I can remind him that his son is 13 years old and just had his entire world turned upside down. The last thing Ethan needs is his father treating this like another problem to be optimized and solved. Catherine packed away her tablet with precise movements. I'll have the employment documentation ready by tomorrow. Sign it, follow it. And Miss Morales? She paused at the hallway entrance. Be careful. Men like Julian Crow aren't used to being challenged. They're especially not used to being challenged by people they employ. This could go very well or very badly, and the difference will depend on factors you can't control. Story of my life, Lena said, but she understood the warning. She was walking into territory that had ended badly for people with far more education and resources than a housekeeper from the Tenderloin. But when she thought about Ethan's hand pressing against his ear over and over, suffering in silence because he'd learned that speaking up only brought more of the wrong kind of help, she knew she'd made the right choice. Someone needed to be in that house for the boy, not the billionaire, even if it cost her everything. They brought Ethan home that evening in a car that felt nothing like the silent rides he'd taken to countless medical appointments over the years. This time, every bump in the road translated into sound, muffled and distant, but there. The engine's hum, the turn signal's rhythmic click, his father's voice from the front seat, talking to someone on the phone using words Ethan could actually hear, not just lip read. Yes, I understand the timeline, but we're going to proceed at a pace that works for Ethan, not on some predetermined schedule. Julian paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. I don't care what's typical. My son just got his hearing back after 8 years. We're not rushing him through this like it's a business merger. Ethan leaned his head against the car window, feeling the vibrations through the glass, and tried to process the fact that this was real. The doctors had confirmed it, 30% hearing capacity in his right ear, enough for functional hearing with proper aids and therapy. They'd fitted him with a temporary device before discharge, warned him it would take time to adjust, that sounds would be strange and overwhelming at first. They hadn't been kidding. Everything was noise. The car, the phone, his father's voice, the outside world bleeding through the windows. It crashed over him in waves that were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. He couldn't distinguish half of what he was hearing. His brain kept trying to fill in gaps with memories from 8 years ago, when he'd been 5 and sound had been normal, expected, unremarkable. Ms. Rodriguez sat beside him in the back seat, monitoring him with professional concern. She'd been apologizing since yesterday, saying she should have noticed the ear pain, should have done a basic examination, should have been more observant. Ethan had tried to tell her it wasn't her fault. He'd hidden it deliberately, after all. But guilt apparently didn't respond to logic. How are you feeling? She asked now, signing as she spoke. The old habit automatic even though he could hear her words. Tired, Ethan answered, and his own voice still startled him. It sounded wrong, too loud, too rough, shaped differently than he remembered, and kind of overwhelmed. That's normal. Dr. Michaels said the adjustment period would be intense. If it becomes too much, you can always remove the hearing aid, give yourself breaks. But that was the thing. Ethan didn't want breaks. He wanted to hear everything, all at once, 8 years of silence compensated for in one overwhelming rush. He wanted to know what rain sounded like against windows, what his father's laugh sounded like, whether he could recognize people by their voices the way he'd learned to recognize them by their footsteps and shadows. They pulled through the estate gates, and Ethan saw Lena waiting on the front steps. His father had explained the new arrangement during one of the hospital waiting periods, how Lena would be staying on, how her role would be informal but important, how Julian wanted someone around who Ethan trusted. Ethan had just nodded, relieved that the person who'd actually helped him wasn't being punished for it. Lena approached as they got out of the car, her expression warm but cautious. How are you doing? Her voice was new to him, accented, warm, with a slight rasp that suggested years of use. Ethan tried to match it to her face, this woman who cleaned his house, and somehow saw what million-dollar specialist had missed. It's really loud, he said. Everything is really, really loud. Lena smiled. Then maybe we start quiet. Come on. I made soup. Nothing fancy, just something warm. We can eat in the breakfast room instead of the formal dining room, less echo. It was such a small thing, but Ethan felt something in his chest loosen. Less echo. She was thinking about how sound would affect him, adjusting the environment instead of forcing him to adjust. Julian had already disappeared into his office, phone still attached to his ear, handling the next crisis or opportunity or whatever occupied a tech billionaire's attention. But he paused at the doorway, looking back at Ethan with an expression that was complicated and raw. "Take it slow," he said, and Ethan could hear the effort in his father's voice. "No rush, no pressure. Just take it slow." Then he was gone, and Ethan was left standing in the foyer of his house, hearing it for the first time. The hum of climate control, the distant sound of water in pipes, the way his own footsteps echoed on marble. "Weird, isn't it?" Lena said quietly, standing beside him. "Hearing your own life like it's brand new." "How did you know?" "My mother has Alzheimer's. Sometimes when I visit, she has moments of clarity, just a few seconds where she remembers everything, recognizes me, knows where she is. And you can see it in her eyes, that vertigo of sudden awareness, like waking up in a place that should be familiar but feels completely foreign." Ethan looked at her, this housekeeper who'd changed everything, and realized he'd spent so much time being noticed by specialists who only saw his deafness. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen by someone who understood what it meant to be human and complicated and more than your medical condition. "Thank you," he said, "for not asking me a million questions about how I feel or what I'm experiencing or what it's like." Lena's expression softened. "You've had enough of that, I think. Come on, let's get some food in you. Then maybe you can show me what sounds you've been most curious about. We can explore them together, at whatever pace you want." They walked towards the breakfast room together, and Ethan heard his own footsteps alongside hers, 2 different rhythms, 2 different weights, creating a pattern that was new and strange and somehow comforting. Behind them, in his office, Julian stood at the window overlooking the bay and tried to understand how his entire world had shifted in less than 48 hours. His son could hear. The impossible had happened. Everything he'd been chasing, everything he'd spent millions trying to buy, had been delivered by a housekeeper with no medical training and a willingness to notice what everyone else ignored. He should feel triumphant, vindicated, relieved. Instead, he felt hollow. Catherine had emailed him the preliminary findings from the medical review she'd initiated. 8 years of specialists, and not one had performed a basic otoscopic examination of Ethan's ear canal after the initial meningitis diagnosis. The blockage had probably been there from before the illness. A childhood accident, a bead from some forgotten toy lodged deep and slowly working its way into a position where it created pressure and pain. The meningitis had caused real cochlear damage, but it hadn't caused total deafness. With the blockage removed, Ethan had about 30% hearing capacity, not enough to be considered hearing in most medical definitions, but infinitely more than the absolute silence he'd endured for 8 years. 8 years of his son suffering unnecessarily because Julian had trusted expensive expertise over simple observation. The phone on his desk buzzed. Patricia, ever efficient with a list of media requests, apparently word had leaked about Ethan's miracle recovery, and everyone from medical journals to morning shows wanted the story. Julian deleted the message without reading it. He didn't need the world knowing how badly he'd failed his own child, how he'd been so busy chasing complicated solutions, he'd missed the simple truth that his son was in pain and trying to hide it. A knock on the office door interrupted his spiral. Marcus Webb stepped inside, his expression carefully neutral. "Sir, I've completed the expanded background check you requested on Miss Morales." Julian gestured for him to continue. "She's exactly who she claimed to be. No hidden agendas, no suspicious connections. She's worked as a domestic employee for 23 years, always gets excellent references, and she's currently working 3 jobs to cover her mother's care facility costs. St. Anne's runs about $7,000 a month. Her sister helps, but most of it falls on Ms. Morales." $7,000 a month. Julian did the math automatically. $84,000 a year, which was probably more than Lena made across all 3 jobs combined. She was drowning in debt to care for a mother who didn't even recognize her anymore, and she'd turned down his offer of additional compensation. "Why 3 jobs?" Julian asked. "We pay competitive wages." "She needs flexibility. Your household employs her Monday through Friday, 6 to 2. She works evenings at a restaurant in the marina, weekends at a hotel in Union Square. It's how she maintains enough hours while still being able to visit her mother daily. Julian stared at the report Marcus had compiled. Lena Morales, 42 years old, immigrant, high school educated, working herself to exhaustion across 3 jobs to pay for care that would never bring her mother back. And she'd walked into his house, noticed his son's pain, and helped him without any thought of reward or recognition. "What's St. Anne's reputation?" he asked. Marcus hesitated. "It's adequate. Not bad, but not exceptional. Your average middle-tier facility. If she had more resources, there are better options. Places with more specialized Alzheimer's care, better staff-to-patient ratios, experimental programs. Better options, more resources." Julian's entire worldview reduced to a simple formula: identify the problem, throw money at it, expect results. It had built his empire. It had also kept him from noticing his own son was suffering right in front of him. "Thank you, Marcus. That'll be all." The security chief left, and Julian returned to the window, watching the sun set over the bay. Somewhere in this house, his son was hearing his own life for the first time in 8 years, discovering sounds, experiencing wonder, processing a transformation that should have been impossible. And Julian, who'd orchestrated it all, who'd hired every specialist, funded every treatment, demanded every innovation, had contributed nothing to the actual solution except money and misplaced certainty. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. 3 days later, Lena arrived at work to find Ethan in the kitchen, face buried in his arms at the breakfast table. His hearing aid sat beside him, a small, expensive piece of technology that was supposed to be changing his life. She set down her bag carefully, moved into his line of sight before speaking. "Rough morning?" Ethan looked up, and she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "Everything is too much. The refrigerator hums, the clock ticks, the air conditioning whooshes. I can hear my own breathing, and it sounds weird. I took the aid out because I needed silence." Lena pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "That makes sense. You spent 8 years in silence. Of course, noise is overwhelming. Dr. Michaels says I need to keep the aid in as much as possible, build tolerance, train my brain to process sound, but it's..." He stopped, frustration evident in every line of his posture. "It's exhausting and confusing, and I can't tell if sounds are important or just background noise. Everything feels urgent." "What does your dad say?" Ethan's expression flickered with something complicated. "He keeps asking if the aid is working properly, if we need to try a different model, if there's a better specialist. He wants to fix it, make it easier, throw money at the problem until it stops being hard." "But you can't fix hard," Lena said gently. "You can only walk through it." "Exactly." Ethan slumped back in his chair. "I tried to explain that I need time, that this is a huge adjustment, and I can't just switch from 8 years of silence to full-time hearing overnight. But he doesn't get it. He thinks there should be a solution, a technique, a better device." Lena thought about Julian in his office, trying to solve his son's humanity like it was a coding problem. "Your dad loves you. He's just scared of things he can't control. And watching you struggle is probably the least controllable thing he's ever experienced." "I'm not struggling," Ethan protested. "I'm adjusting. There's a difference." "There is, but I'm not sure your dad knows how to see the difference." They sat in the quiet kitchen, which wasn't really quiet, Lena realized. There were all those background sounds Ethan had mentioned, things hearing people learn to filter out so automatically they forgot they were there. She tried to imagine experiencing them all at once, with no framework for sorting important from trivial. "Want to know what helped me?" she asked. "When my mom first started showing symptoms of Alzheimer's, everyone kept telling me about support groups, medical interventions, care strategies. But what actually helped was just letting myself feel overwhelmed. Admitting it was hard, not trying to fix it or manage it or optimize it, just existing in the difficulty until it became slightly less difficult." Ethan studied her face, studied. "Did it get easier?" "Some parts did. Some parts are still really hard. She doesn't recognize me most days now. I visit, and I'm just some nice lady who sits with her. It kills me every single time." Lena's voice roughened slightly. "But I keep visiting, Not because it fixes anything or because I'm handling it well, just because she's my mom and I love her. And that's what you do. The words settled between them, honest and raw. Ethan nodded slowly. I keep thinking I should be more grateful, he said quietly. Everyone's so excited about this miracle, my hearing coming back. And I am grateful, I am, but I'm also just really tired and confused. And I kind of miss the silence sometimes, which feels wrong to say out loud. It's not wrong, Lena said firmly. Silence was your normal for 8 years. Of course you miss it. That doesn't mean you don't appreciate hearing. It just means you're human and change is complicated. Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly. You're the only person who's said that. Everyone else acts like I should be celebrating every second, like there's something ungrateful about finding this hard. Well, everyone else can try adjusting to a complete sensory revolution and then judge. Until then, you get to feel however you feel about it. A small smile crossed Ethan's face, the first genuine expression Lena had seen from him since the hospital. Thanks, Lena. Anytime, kid. They sat together a while longer, comfortable in the kind of quiet that didn't require filling. Then Ethan picked up his hearing aid, studied it for a moment, and fitted it back into his ear. The world rushed in again. Refrigerator, clock, air conditioning, breathing, but this time he didn't flinch away from it. Maybe I can do this in intervals, he said. An hour on, 30 minutes off. Build up gradually instead of trying to go full-time immediately. Sounds reasonable to me. Dr. Michaels won't like it. Doctor, Michaels can have an opinion. You get to make the decision. Ethan's expression shifted, something like relief washing over his features. I'm not used to that. Making my own decisions about my medical stuff. It's always been Dad and the specialist deciding what's best. Well, Lena said, standing and moving toward the coffee maker, maybe that's something else that gets to change. You're 13, not 5. You get a say in how this goes. Behind them, unnoticed in the hallway, Julian stood frozen. He'd been heading to the kitchen for coffee before his first meeting, but he'd stopped when he heard Ethan's voice, still so new, so rough, so impossibly precious after 8 years of silence. And now he'd overheard a conversation that felt like being gutted with a spoon. His son missed the silence, found the hearing overwhelming, felt pressured to be grateful when what he actually felt was exhausted and confused. And the only person Ethan felt safe admitting that to was the housekeeper, because his own father was too busy trying to optimize the miracle to notice it was also a struggle. Julian backed away from the kitchen slowly, carefully, returning to his office with his coffee unmade and his chest tight with recognition. He'd done it again, taken something that should have been about Ethan and made it about solving, fixing, improving. He'd been so focused on getting the best hearing aid, the best therapist, the best audiology program, he'd never stopped to ask Ethan what he actually needed, which was apparently just permission to find it hard, space to adjust at his own pace, a father who could sit with difficulty without immediately trying to eliminate it. Julian sat at his desk and pulled up Catherine's latest email. She'd compiled a list of the absolute best specialists in auditory therapy, along with proposals for expanding Ethan's treatment plan. 3 sessions a week instead of 1. Advanced speech therapy. Auditory training programs. A comprehensive approach designed to maximize his 30% hearing capacity. It was exactly what Julian would have done a week ago. Throw every resource at the problem, demand optimal outcomes, refuse to accept anything less than the best possible results. But now, having heard his son say, "I'm tired of being your next problem to solve," followed by, "I kind of miss the silence sometimes," Julian looked at that list of interventions and recognized it for what it was. Another way to control something that couldn't be controlled. Another attempt to manage his own fear by managing his son's experience. He deleted the email and started a new one to Dr. Michaels. Regarding Ethan's treatment schedule, we need to scale back. Not eliminate, but reduce. Give him space to adjust at his own pace. I'll call tomorrow to discuss revised timeline. It felt wrong, hitting send. Every instinct screamed at him to do more, not less. To optimize, not accommodate. To solve the problem instead of sitting with the discomfort. But maybe, Julian thought, that's exactly why he needed to do it. Maybe the real miracle wasn't his son's hearing returning. Maybe it was learning to love Ethan for who he actually was. rather than who Julian kept trying to make him become. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than building companies, harder than recovering from his wife's death, harder than anything he'd accomplished in his carefully controlled life. Doing nothing, letting go, trusting that his son could navigate this without Julian orchestrating every detail. In the kitchen, Lena and Ethan were laughing about something. Lena's voice warm and unguarded, Ethan's rough and uncertain but genuine. The sound drifted through the house like evidence of a life Julian had almost missed by being too busy trying to create the perfect version of it. He closed his laptop, stood, and walked toward the kitchen. Not to fix anything, not to announce new plans or better solutions. Just to listen, to be present, to start learning the difference between love as control and love as witness. It was, he suspected, going to be the longest, hardest education of his life. And for the first time in 8 years, Julian Crow had no idea if he was capable of passing the test. Julian stepped into the kitchen doorway just as Ethan was attempting to describe what the coffee maker sounded like. It's like gurgling, but also hissing. I don't have the words for it yet. Lena glanced up and saw Julian standing there, his expression unreadable. She'd worked for enough wealthy families to recognize the moment when an employer realized they'd walked into a scene they hadn't scripted. Her instinct was to excuse herself, return to her designated role, let the billionaire reclaim his territory. But Ethan had seen his father too, and something in the boy's posture shifted, not quite tensing, but preparing, getting ready for whatever came next. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice still carrying that roughness of disuse. "I thought you had early meetings." "Canceled them." Julian moved into the kitchen with careful steps, like he was approaching something fragile that might shatter if he moved too quickly. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Lena started to rise. "I should get to work." "Please stay," Julian said, and the please landed with unexpected weight. "This involves you too, in a way." She settled back into her chair, watching father and son face each other across the breakfast table. The morning light coming through the windows caught both of them at angles that emphasized their similarities. Same dark eyes, same careful way of holding themselves, same intelligence that looked like it could cut glass when properly focused. Julian pulled out a chair and sat, a gesture so ordinary it seemed to surprise all three of them. In the month Lena had worked here, she'd never seen him sit at the breakfast table. He ate at his desk, or not at all, perpetually in motion, perpetually managing the next crisis. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the hospital," Julian began, his hands folded on the table in front of him, "about the specialists I brought in, the treatments we tried, all the money I spent trying to fix something I thought was broken." Ethan's expression closed down slightly, bracing for whatever speech was coming. "And I realized something." Julian's voice roughened. "I was so focused on solving the deafness, I never stopped to ask if you needed solving. I never asked what you actually wanted. I just decided what was best and expected you to go along with it because I was your father, and I loved you, and love meant fixing things." The words hung in the air like objects with weight and edges. Lena watched Ethan's face carefully, saw the conflict playing out behind his eyes. "You were trying to help," Ethan said quietly. "I was trying to control something that terrified me." "There's a difference." Julian's jaw tightened. "When your mother died, when you lost your hearing, everything that mattered most became something I couldn't control. And instead of accepting that, instead of just being present with you in the difficulty, I threw money at it. I brought in experts. I demanded solutions. I turned your life into a project I could manage instead of just being your father." Ethan's breath caught audibly. Lena could see his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I'm sorry," Julian continued, and his voice cracked on the words. "I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm sorry I didn't notice you were in pain. I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to be grateful for miracles instead of just letting you be 13 and overwhelmed and human." Lena felt something in her chest tighten. This was not a speech a man like Julian Crow gave easily. This was vulnerability from someone who'd built an empire on control, admission of failure from someone who'd made billions on being right. "I heard you this morning," Julian said, looking directly at his son, "telling Lena that you miss the silence sometimes, that you're tired, that this is hard. And it killed me because you couldn't tell me those things. Because I'd created an environment where the only acceptable response to getting your hearing back was gratitude and celebration. Dad, Ethan's voice wavered. Let me finish, please. Julian took a breath that looked like it hurt. I called Dr. Michaels this morning and told her we're reducing the therapy schedule, not eliminating it, but scaling back, giving you space to adjust at your own pace. And I'm telling you right now, you get to decide how this goes. You want to wear the hearing aid for an hour and take it off for 30 minutes? Fine. You want days where you just need silence? That's fine too. You're not a project. You're my son, and I should have been treating you like one all along. The kitchen had gone so quiet that Lena could hear the refrigerator's hum, the distant sound of gardeners working outside, her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. This was a turning point, the kind of moment that would define their relationship going forward, and she was witnessing it from 3 feet away. Ethan stared at his father, his expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. You mean that? You're actually going to let me have a say in this? I mean it. Julian struggled visibly with the words. I'm going to try. I'm probably going to fail sometimes because I've spent 8 years operating one way and changing that won't happen overnight. But I'm going to try to listen instead of solving, to be present instead of managing, to trust that you know what you need better than any specialist I could hire. Ethan's eyes filled with tears that he didn't bother hiding. I was so tired, Dad. I'm still tired. Everyone keeps acting like this is a miracle and I should be thrilled every second, but mostly I'm just confused and overwhelmed and I don't know how to be the person everyone expects me to be now. Then don't be, Julian said, and Lena could see his own eyes glistening. Just be you, however that looks, however that sounds, whatever pace that takes. Ethan stood abruptly and moved around the table, and Julian rose to meet him. They came together in an embrace that looked like it was holding up the weight of 8 years of miscommunication and missed connections. Lena quietly stood and started to leave, giving them privacy for this moment. Wait, Julian said, pulling back from Ethan but keeping one hand on his son's shoulder. Lena, I owe you an apology too. She turned, surprised. Sir? I hired you to clean floors. Instead, you ended up being what we actually needed. Someone who paid attention, who noticed, who cared enough to act even when it meant stepping outside comfortable boundaries. I should have thanked you properly for that, instead of immediately trying to formalize it and control it and turn it into something I could manage. You don't need to apologize for, yes, I do. Julian's expression was serious. You've been working 3 jobs to pay for your mother's care. Marcus told me. St. Anne's runs about $7,000 a month. Lena's spine stiffened. That's my business, Mr. Crow. It is. But I'm also a man who just learned the hard way that sometimes the most important thing isn't throwing money at problems. Sometimes it's actually seeing the people around you as human beings with their own struggles and dignity. He paused. I looked into St. Anne's. It's adequate, but there are better facilities for Alzheimer's patients. Places with more specialized care, better programs. If you wanted help moving your mother somewhere with more resources, I'd like to assist with that, not as payment for what you did for Ethan, as, he struggled with the word, as something one human does for another when they have the means to help. Lena felt her throat tighten. Why would you do that? Because you gave me my son's voice back. Because you're working yourself to exhaustion trying to care for your mother the same way I was throwing money around trying to care for mine. Because maybe... Julian's voice softened. Maybe we both deserve better than just surviving. The offer hung in the air between them, complicated and genuine. Lena thought about her mother at St. Anne's, staring at walls with eyes that no longer recognized her own daughter. Thought about the better facilities she'd researched obsessively but could never afford, the experimental programs that might give Maria Morales a few more months of clarity. I can't accept charity, she said quietly. It's not charity, it's... Julian searched for the right words. Call it investment in my own education. You're teaching me how to actually see people, how to notice what matters. The least I can do is help with something that clearly matters to you. Ethan had been watching this exchange with wide eyes. Now he spoke up, his voice still rough but firm. Lena, you helped me when you didn't have to, when it could have gotten you in trouble. Let him help you, please. The two crow men looked at her with matching expressions of earnest determination, and Lena felt something inside her crack open. She'd spent 23 years being invisible, being the help, being someone who served without expecting anything in return. The idea that she could ask for help, could accept it without shame or obligation, felt almost foreign. I'd want to visit the facilities first, she said carefully. Meet the staff. Make sure it's actually better for my mother, not just more expensive. Julian nodded. Absolutely. Catherine can set up tours. You choose the place. We handle the logistics and financing. Your mother gets the best care available, and you get to visit her without working 3 jobs to afford it. I'd still work, Lena said firmly. I need to work. I need purpose. Then work here, full time, not as a housekeeper, unless you want to be. Julian glanced at Ethan, then back to Lena. As someone who helps me remember that people matter more than problems. Someone who notices when things are wrong, even when everyone else is looking the other way. I don't have a title for it because I've never needed it before, but I need it now. Lena looked between father and son, seeing the sincerity in both their faces. This was dangerous territory. Accepting this offer meant entangling her life with theirs in ways that could end badly. Rich people were generous until they weren't, helpful until it became inconvenient. But she thought about her mother, about the possibility of better care, about not having to work herself to exhaustion just to afford adequate treatment. She thought about Ethan, who still needed someone who saw him as a person rather than a patient. She thought about Julian, who was trying, genuinely trying, to become a better father, even though it clearly terrified him. I'll think about it, she said, but I need time. This is a big decision. Take whatever time you need, Julian said. The offer stands. A phone buzzed, Julian's, vibrating against the table where he'd set it down. He glanced at it, and Lena saw his expression shift into something harder, more controlled. That's the legal team, he said. They've completed the preliminary review of Ethan's medical records. Catherine wants to schedule a meeting to discuss next steps regarding the specialists who missed the blockage. Ethan tensed. What kind of next steps? The kind that holds people accountable for 8 years of negligence. Julian's voice had taken on an edge that Lena recognized. The tech billionaire who'd built an empire on precision and refused to tolerate failure. Those doctors took millions of dollars and missed something a housekeeper with basic first aid training found in 4 days. That's not acceptable. Dad, Ethan started. No, this is important. They need to answer for what they did, or rather, what they didn't do. Lena watched the dynamic shift in real time. Julian, who'd just finished apologizing for trying to control everything, was already falling back into old patterns. This time the target wasn't his son's hearing, it was the specialist who'd failed to fix it. But the impulse was the same. Identify the problem, attack it with resources and determination, demand accountability. Mr. Crow, Lena said carefully, maybe you should ask Ethan how he feels about this before you start planning legal action. Julian's jaw tightened. This isn't about feelings, it's about accountability. Those doctors failed to find something that was deeply lodged and easily missed if they weren't specifically looking for physical blockages. Lena interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. They were brought in to evaluate neural damage, to explore experimental treatments for cochlear nerve restoration. How many of them were actually hired to perform basic otoscopic examinations? The question landed like a challenge. Julian stared at her, and Lena could see him processing the logic, fighting against the emotional need to blame someone for 8 years of his son's suffering. They should have checked, he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Maybe. But you hired them for specialized consultations, not comprehensive care. They did what you paid them to do, evaluated the specific problems you brought them in to solve. Lena paused, weighing her next words. The real question isn't why they missed it. It's why no one was looking at the whole picture. Why Ethan didn't have a regular doctor doing routine examinations instead of a parade of specialists chasing expensive solutions. The words hung heavy in the kitchen. Julian's expression went through several shifts before landing on something that looked like recognition mixed with resistance. So I should just let it go? Pretend it doesn't matter that my son suffered for 8 years because of incompetence? I'm saying maybe legal warfare isn't actually about accountability. Maybe it's about having someone to blame so you don't have to sit with the harder truth. Lena met his eyes steadily, which is that everyone involved, including you, was so focused on the big dramatic solution, nobody stopped to check the simple basics. Ethan was watching this exchange with something like fascination. His father, the man who controlled boardrooms and demolished competitors, was being directly challenged by a housekeeper who refused to back down. "You're out of line," Julian said, but there was no heat in it, just exhaustion. "Probably," Lena agreed, "but you asked me to help you see people instead of problems. Well, those specialists are people too. People who were hired to do specialized work, who did that work to the best of their abilities based on the parameters you set. Going after them legally doesn't change what happened, it just creates more problems to solve." Julian stood abruptly, paced to the window, stood there with his hands in his pockets. The gardeners outside were trimming hedges, their movements visible through the glass. Normal people doing normal work, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in the billionaire's kitchen. "Then what do I do?" he asked, his back still turned. "How do I process 8 years of my son's suffering when someone should have caught this earlier?" "You let it be hard," Lena said quietly. "You sit with the anger and the grief and the guilt instead of trying to solve it away. You accept that sometimes terrible things happen not because someone is evil or negligent, but because life is complicated and humans are fallible and we all do the best we can with what we know at the time." Julian turned to face her, and Lena could see the rawness in his expression. "I don't know how to do that. I've spent my entire adult life solving problems. It's what I'm good at. It's who I am." "Then maybe," Ethan said softly, his voice drawing both adults' attention, "you need to learn how to be something else, at least when it comes to me." Father and son looked at each other across the kitchen, and Lena could see the moment when Julian understood what his child was really asking for. Not solutions, not revenge, not grand gestures or expensive interventions, just presence, just acceptance, just love that didn't come with a price tag or an action plan. "Okay," Julian said finally, the words sounding like it cost him everything. "Okay. I'll tell Catherine to close the investigation. No lawsuits, no legal action. We move forward instead of looking for people to blame." Ethan's whole body relaxed, relief washing over his features. "Thank you." Julian nodded stiffly, then left the kitchen before either of them could see how much that concession had shaken him. Lena heard his office door close a moment later, heard the sound of a man trying to hold himself together in private. "That was really hard for him," Ethan observed, still staring at the doorway his father had disappeared through. "Change is always hard, especially when it means giving up something you're good at in exchange for something you don't know how to do yet." Ethan turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "He's going to keep messing up, isn't he? Keep falling back into trying to control everything." "Probably," Lena said honestly, "but he's trying. That's more than a lot of people manage." They sat together in the morning light, listening to the sounds of the house, refrigerator humming, clock ticking, distant voices of staff going about their work. Ordinary sounds that Ethan was still learning to categorize and understand. The world made noise, constant and unremarkable, and he was finally part of it again. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said after a while. "Of course." "Why did you really help me? That first day when you noticed I was in pain? You could have just reported it to Ms. Rodriguez and let her handle it. Why did you look yourself?" Lena considered the question, searching for honesty beneath the easy answers. "Because I've spent my whole life being invisible. The help. The person who cleans up messes but doesn't get involved in the actual lives happening around them. And I'm good at it. Being invisible, I mean. It's safe. It keeps things simple." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But then I saw you pressing your hand to your ear over and over, trying to hide how much it hurt, and I recognized something in that. My mother does the same thing now with her confusion, tries to hide it, act like everything's fine, because admitting struggle feels like failure. And I thought about all the times I'd watched her suffer because I was respecting boundaries or staying in my lane or being professional instead of just being her daughter and helping her." Ethan listened with complete attention, his new hearing focused on every word. "So when I saw you hurting, I decided that this time I was going to be the person who noticed, who cared, who stepped outside the comfortable boundaries and actually did something, even if it meant risking my job or getting in trouble or exposing myself to consequences I couldn't control. Lena met his eyes. I helped you because I needed to prove to myself that I could, that I wasn't so committed to being invisible that I'd watch a child suffer, rather than cross a line. I'm glad you did, Ethan said quietly. Cross the line, I mean, not just because of the hearing, because you saw me, really saw me, not the deaf kid or the billionaire's son or the patient with the complicated medical history. Just me. You're worth seeing, Ethan. Don't let anyone, including your father, make you forget that. The conversation was interrupted by Ms. Rodriguez appearing in the doorway, her expression uncertain. Ethan, you have speech therapy in an hour. Dr. Brennan also called to confirm your tutoring session this afternoon. Lena watched Ethan's face carefully, saw the conflict playing out. The hearing aid was still in, had been for almost 90 minutes now. He was probably exhausted, probably overwhelmed, probably ready for a break. What do you want to do? Lena asked him directly. Ethan looked surprised that someone was asking. He thought for a moment, then said, I want to do the speech therapy, but I need 30 minutes of quiet first. And I want to take the aid out during tutoring. I can't focus on calculus while also processing new sounds. Miss Rodriguez started to object. But Dr. Michaels said, Dr. Michaels doesn't get to decide, Lena said gently but firmly. Ethan does. He's saying he'll do the therapy but needs breaks. That's reasonable. The nurse looked between them, clearly uncomfortable with this new dynamic where the patient had agency. But finally she nodded. All right, I'll let Dr. Brennan know you'll be using sign language during the session. After she left, Ethan grinned at Lena. That felt good. Making my own choice about my schedule. Get used to it. You're 13, not a passive recipient of other people's decisions about your life. My dad's not going to like this. Me taking control. Your dad's learning, Lena corrected. Give him time. He'll get there. But even as she said it, Lena wondered if that was true. Julian Crow had spent decades being a man who solved problems and controlled outcomes. Learning to be someone else, someone who listened and accepted and trusted, would require more than a single morning's epiphany. It would require fundamental change. And change, as Lena knew from watching her mother disappear into Alzheimer's one memory at a time, was the hardest thing humans were asked to endure. In his office, Julian sat at his desk with Catherine's legal memo open on his screen, his finger hovering over the delete button. 8 years of negligence, the memo began. Clear patterns of oversight failure. Strong case for malpractice litigation across multiple defendants. The old Julian would have forwarded this to the legal team with instructions to pursue maximum accountability. Would have relished the fight, the vindication, the satisfaction of making people pay for their failures. But the new Julian, or rather, the Julian he was trying to become, kept hearing Lena's voice. Going after them legally doesn't change what happened. It just creates more problems to solve. He deleted the memo. Then he opened a new email to Catherine. Close the investigation. No legal action. Let's focus on moving forward instead of assigning blame. His hand shook slightly as he hit send. Everything in him screamed that this was wrong, that he was letting people off the hook, that accountability mattered. But maybe, he thought, maybe accountability looked different than he'd always assumed. Maybe it looked like taking responsibility for his own role in creating an environment where specialists chased expensive solutions instead of checking simple basics. Maybe it looked like accepting that he'd failed his son not through malice but through the same blind spots that had affected everyone else. Maybe accountability started with himself. The thought was uncomfortable enough that Julian immediately wanted to do something to alleviate it. Call someone. Make a decision. Take action that would restore his sense of control over an increasingly uncontrollable situation. Instead, he forced himself to sit still, to feel the discomfort instead of solving it, to practice being present with difficulty the way Lena had described. It was the hardest thing he'd done in years. Harder than any business negotiation, harder than any technical problem, harder than building companies from nothing, just sitting, just being, just accepting that some things couldn't be fixed or managed or optimized into submission. Outside his office, life in the estate continued. Staff moved through their routines. Ethan prepared for speech therapy. Lena went about her work, noticing things that everyone else missed, being the kind of present that Julian was only beginning to understand. And somewhere in the city, in a modest care facility called Saint, Anne's Maria Morales sat in her room staring at photographs of a daughter she no longer recognized, waiting for visits from a stranger who held her hand and called her mama, and refused to give up even though there was nothing left to fix. The world was full of problems that couldn't be solved, Julian realized, full of people who suffered despite everyone's best efforts, full of loss and difficulty and things that money and determination couldn't change. Learning to exist in that reality without constantly trying to eliminate it, that was the work. That was what Lena had been trying to teach him. That was what his son needed from him more than any specialist or treatment or expensive solution. Just presence. Just witness. Just love that didn't come with a requirement to fix everything. Julian Crow, billionaire problem solver, sat in his office and tried to learn how to do absolutely nothing except feel his own humanity. It was, he suspected, going to take the rest of his life, and he still wasn't sure he was capable of it. 2 weeks later, Lena stood in the lobby of Heritage Gardens, a specialized Alzheimer's care facility in Marin County, and tried to reconcile the marble floors and original artwork with the concept of a place where people went to forget everything they'd ever loved. Catherine Chen stood beside her, tablet in hand, going through specifications with the clinical efficiency of someone who negotiated million-dollar deals before breakfast. The staff-to-patient ratio is 3-to-1 during day hours, 2-to-1 overnight. They have a dedicated memory care wing with sensory gardens, music therapy, and a specialized program for Spanish-speaking patients that includes culturally relevant activities. "How much does this cost?" Lena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Mr. Crow has arranged for full coverage through a medical trust. You don't need to worry about the financial aspects." "That's not what I asked." Catherine glanced up from her tablet, something like respect flickering across her professional mask. $18,000 per month, plus additional costs for specialized therapies and medical care as needed. Lena felt the number hit her like a physical blow. 18,000, more than twice what St. Anne's charged, more than she made in half a year across 3 jobs. The kind of money that existed in a completely different universe from her own life. "I can't accept this," she said quietly. "Miss Morales, we've been through this. Mr. Crow wants to help. Mr. Crow wants to solve a problem. That's what he does. He sees someone struggling and he throws money at it until the struggle goes away. But my mother isn't a problem to be solved. She's a person. And I need to know that moving her here is actually better for her, not just more expensive." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "That's why we're doing these tours. So you can make an informed decision based on what's actually best for your mother, not on cost." The director of Heritage Gardens appeared then, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the sort of calm competence that came from years of managing difficult situations. "Ms. Morales? I'm Dr. Sarah Winters. I understand you'd like to tour our memory care facilities." Lena shook her hand, feeling the weight of this decision pressing down on her shoulders. "My mother has advanced Alzheimer's. She's been at St. Anne's for 3 years. I visit every day. I need to know that if I move her here, she'll actually be better off, not just," she struggled for the words, "more expensively warehoused." Dr. Winters didn't flinch at the bluntness. "Come with me. I'll show you our program, introduce you to our staff, and you can decide for yourself. Fair enough?" The tour that followed was simultaneously heartbreaking and hopeful. The memory care wing was designed to feel like a neighborhood from the 1950s, complete with a vintage-style diner, a mock bus stop, and residential spaces that mimicked the homes these patients might remember from their youth. The idea was to create environments that triggered older memories, providing comfort even as recent memory faded. "Many of our residents have trouble with new information," Dr. Winters explained as they walked through a common area where elderly patients were engaged in various activities. "But they can often access memories from decades ago with remarkable clarity. We try to meet them where they are, rather than forcing them to exist in a present they no longer understand." Lena watched an elderly woman carefully setting a table in the mock diner, humming to herself. A staff member worked alongside her, not correcting or directing, just being present as the woman completed a task that clearly brought her comfort and purpose. "Our Spanish language program is particularly robust," Dr. Winters continued. We have staff who are native speakers, and we incorporate cultural elements, music, food, celebrations, that resonate with patients' long-term memories. For someone like your mother who emigrated from El Salvador, we'd focus on those cultural touchpoints. They entered a sensory garden where residents could safely wander, touching plants, listening to water features, experiencing the world through senses that often remained intact even as cognitive function declined. An elderly man sat on a bench, eyes closed, listening to a fountain with an expression of complete peace. This is where my mother would spend her time, Lena said quietly, imagining Maria in this space. She always loved gardens. We had a small one behind our apartment when I was growing up. She'd spend hours there talking to the plants like they were old friends. We could assign her a small plot if she'd enjoy tending it, Dr. Winters offered. Many of our residents find comfort in repetitive, familiar activities. Gardening, folding laundry, setting tables. These tasks connect them to muscle memories that persist even when other memories fade. Lena felt something crack open in her chest. For 3 years, she'd watched her mother sit in a room at St. Anne's with nothing to do, nowhere to go, no connection to the life she'd lived. The staff there were kind but overworked, the activities minimal, the environment sterile and institutional. This place, expensive as it was, fancy as it seemed, actually appeared to see patients as people with histories and preferences and inner lives that mattered even when they could no longer articulate them clearly. "Can I see a resident room?" Lena asked. Dr. Winters led them to a private suite that was spacious and filled with natural light. The room was decorated simply but with touches that could be personalized. Photo displays, familiar objects, spaces for family to visit comfortably. "We encourage families to bring items from home," Dr. Winters explained. "Photographs, quilts, favorite chairs, music, anything that creates continuity between the life they remember and where they are now." Lena thought about her mother's room at St. Anne's, sparse, generic, the few photographs on the wall looking lost against the beige paint. She thought about Maria sitting there day after day, waiting for a daughter she no longer recognized, trapped in a present that offered no comfort and a memory that offered no escape. "What happens when they don't recognize visitors anymore?" Lena asked, her voice rough. "When family comes and they're just strangers?" Dr. Winters' expression filled with gentle understanding. "That's the hardest part. For families more than patients, honestly. Your mother may not remember your name or your relationship, but she'll likely still respond to your presence. The emotional memory often persists even when the factual memory is gone. She may not know you're her daughter, but she'll know you're someone safe, someone who cares." The words hit Lena with unexpected force. She'd spent 3 years visiting St. Anne's, sitting with a mother who called her dear or sweetheart, or sometimes didn't acknowledge her at all. She'd told herself it didn't matter, that she was doing it out of duty and love regardless of whether Maria remembered. But it had mattered. It had hurt every single time. "I need to think about this," Lena said, her voice barely steady. "This is a big decision. Of course. Take whatever time you need." Dr. Winters handed her a folder with information. "If you decide Heritage Gardens is right for your mother, we'll coordinate the transition to make it as smooth as possible. And Ms. Morales, whatever you decide, the fact that you're here, that you're asking these questions, that tells me your mother is very lucky to have you." Catherine drove Lena back to the city in silence, seeming to understand that platitudes wouldn't help. When they reached the estate, Lena thanked her quietly and headed straight for the service entrance, not ready to face anyone's questions about how the tour had gone. But Ethan was waiting in the kitchen, hearing aid in place, doing homework at the breakfast table. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression must have shown because he immediately closed his textbook. "Bad tour?" he asked, his voice getting clearer every day as speech therapy helped him relearn verbal communication. Lena sank into a chair across from him. "No, that's the problem. It was a good tour, really good. The kind of place my mother deserves. The kind of care I've dreamed about being able to give her." "So what's the problem?" "The problem is I can't afford it, not in a million years. And accepting your father's money to pay for it feels like," she struggled for the words, "like I'm being bought. Like I helped you and now I'm cashing in on it." Ethan frowned, considering this. "Is that what you think Dad's doing? Buying you?" I don't know what he's doing. I don't know if he's trying to be kind, or if he's just solving another problem, or if this is how rich people make themselves feel better about the inequalities in the world. Lena's voice carried an edge of frustration. All I know is that accepting $18,000 a month from him fundamentally changes the relationship. It makes me dependent. It gives him power over something I can't afford to lose. What does your mother need? Ethan asked simply. The question cut through Lena's complicated feelings like a knife. She needs better care. She needs the sensory gardens and the cultural programs and the staff who actually see her as a person, instead of just another patient to warehouse. Then maybe that's what matters. Not the politics of it, not how it makes you feel, just what she needs. Lena looked at this 13-year-old boy who'd spent 8 years navigating a world that constantly made decisions for him and recognized the wisdom in his words. How many times had Ethan wanted to say no to treatments or specialists or interventions, but accepted them anyway because the people around him insisted they knew what was best? When did you get so smart? She asked. Ethan grinned. I've always been smart. People just didn't listen because they were too busy trying to fix me. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Lena laughed, the sound rough but genuine. Your father's in his office? Yeah, he's been on calls all afternoon. Some kind of crisis with one of his companies. Lena stood, smoothing her clothes, preparing herself for a conversation she didn't particularly want to have. Wish me luck. You don't need luck. You need courage, and you've got plenty of that. She left Ethan in the kitchen and made her way through the house to Julian's office. The door was closed, which usually meant he didn't want to be disturbed, but Lena knocked anyway. Come in, came his voice, distracted and edged with irritation. Lena entered to find Julian at his standing desk, 3 monitors displaying various documents and video feeds, phone pressed to his ear. He held up one finger, the universal gesture for "give me a minute," and continued his conversation. No, that's not acceptable. We had an agreement and I expect you to honor it. I don't care what your board is saying. Yes, I'll hold. He put the call on mute, turned to Lena with an expression that softened slightly when he saw her. How was Heritage Gardens? It's perfect. Too perfect. That's why I'm here. Julian's eyebrows rose. You're here to complain that the facility is too good? I'm here to understand what you expect in return for paying $18,000 a month for my mother's care. The bluntness seemed to catch Julian off guard. He blinked, then very deliberately ended his call without returning to it. I expect nothing in return. Everyone expects something in return, Mr. Crow. That's how the world works, especially your world. Julian moved away from his desk, settling into one of the leather chairs near the window. He gestured for Lena to sit across from him, and after a moment's hesitation, she did. What do you think I want? He asked carefully. I think you want to solve a problem. I think you saw someone struggling and you can't help yourself. You have to fix it. I think maybe you also feel guilty that a housekeeper did for your son what millions of dollars couldn't, and this is how you balance the scales. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. You're partially right. I do want to solve problems. It's who I've been for so long, I don't know how to be anything else. But you're wrong about the guilt. How so? I don't feel guilty about what you did for Ethan. I feel grateful, humbled, ashamed that I'd created an environment where my son suffered in silence rather than tell me he was in pain, but not guilty toward you. Julian leaned forward, his gaze intense. What I feel toward you is respect. You saw something wrong, and you acted on it, even though it could have cost you everything. You risked your job, potential legal consequences, my anger, all of it, because you couldn't stand watching a child suffer. That's not something I can repay with money. It's not even something I should try to repay. Then why the offer? Why Heritage Gardens and the medical trust and all of it? Because I'm trying to learn how to be someone different, someone who helps people because he can, not because he expects something in return. Someone who uses his resources for something other than control and advantage. Julian's voice roughened slightly. Lena, I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. It sits in accounts generating more money, accomplishing nothing except making numbers on a screen get bigger. Your mother needs care that you can't afford. I can afford it without even noticing the expense. The math is simple. The math is never simple when power is involved. You're right, but here's what I'm offering. No strings attached, no expectations, no obligations beyond what you're already doing. You work here because Ethan trusts you and because you're teaching me how to be a better father. Your mother gets better care because I have resources to make that happen, and it would be unconscionable not to use them when I know someone is suffering. Those two things are separate. One doesn't depend on the other. Lena studied his face, looking for the catch, the hidden agenda, the thing she was missing. But all she saw was exhaustion and sincerity, and a man genuinely trying to figure out how to be someone other than who he'd always been. What happens if I quit? She asked. If 3 months from now, I decide this isn't working and I leave? Your mother stays at Heritage Gardens. The trust continues. Nothing changes. What happens if Ethan doesn't need me anymore? If he adjusts fully and I'm just extra? Same answer. Your mother's care isn't contingent on your employment. What happens if you decide I've overstepped or challenged you one too many times or stopped being useful? Julian's jaw tightened. Same answer, Lena. I'm trying to do something good here without turning it into a transaction. I'm apparently very bad at it because you don't believe me, but I need you to understand your mother's care is not leverage, it's not conditional. It's just something I can do to help, so I'm doing it. Lena felt tears prick at her eyes, which she hated. She didn't cry in front of employers, didn't show weakness or vulnerability or need. But the idea that her mother could have better care, that Maria could spend her final years in gardens instead of sterile rooms, that Lena herself could visit without the crushing weight of knowing she couldn't afford anything better. It broke something open inside her. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Because you gave me my son back. Because you're teaching me how to be human instead of just being rich. Because... Julian stopped, started again with visible effort. Because my wife died and I threw money at my grief instead of actually processing it. I solved and managed and controlled everything I could because it was easier than accepting that some things can't be fixed. And I passed that same dysfunction on to my son, turned his deafness into my project, his life into my problem to solve. You stopped that. You showed up and noticed and cared and helped in ways that had nothing to do with money or expertise or credentials. So if I can return even a fraction of that by making your mother's final years more comfortable, why wouldn't I? The words hung in the office like a confession. Lena could see what this cost him, admitting failure, acknowledging that his billions hadn't protected him from pain or loss or the fundamental helplessness of being human. Okay, she said finally. Okay? Okay. I'll move my mother to Heritage Gardens. I'll accept your help. But I need you to understand something. This doesn't change who I am or how I work. I'm not going to start treating you differently or stop calling you out when you're falling into old patterns. I'm not going to become someone who's here because you're paying me well instead of because this matters. Something that looked almost like relief crossed Julian's expression. I wouldn't want you to. Ethan needs someone who sees him. I need someone who's willing to tell me when I'm being an idiot. That doesn't change regardless of where your mother lives. Lena nodded, stood, started toward the door, then paused and turned back. Thank you. I don't know if I've said that clearly enough. Thank you for seeing that my mother matters, even though you've never met her. Thank you for understanding that care isn't just about money, it's about dignity and humanity and treating people like they're worth the effort. Julian's expression softened. Your mother raised someone who notices suffering and acts on it even when it's risky. I'd say she did something right. The least I can do is make sure her final years are as comfortable as possible. Lena left the office before the tears could actually fall, walking quickly through the hallways toward the service areas where she could collect herself in private. But she didn't make it that far before encountering Miss Rodriguez in one of the corridors. Lena, are you all right? The nurse's concern was genuine, her professional instincts immediately noting Lena's emotional state. I'm fine, just processing some things. Ms. Rodriguez hesitated, then spoke carefully. I owe you an apology. When you first removed that blockage from Ethan's ear, I was angry. I thought you'd overstepped, risked his safety, done something reckless that could have ended badly. I reported it to Mr. Crow as a potential liability issue. Lena hadn't known that, but it didn't particularly surprise her. You were doing your job. I was protecting myself, Ms. Rodriguez corrected. I was the one who should have noticed Ethan was in pain. I was the one who did daily check-ins and somehow missed what you saw in 4 days. And instead of taking responsibility for that, I focused on your violation of protocols." She paused, her expression pained. "I'm sorry. You did what I should have done, and instead of thanking you, I tried to get you in trouble because it was easier than admitting I'd failed." The confession hung between them in the hallway. Lena could see the genuine regret in the nurse's face, the weight of knowing she'd let a child suffer because she was following routines instead of actually observing. "We all missed it," Lena said gently. "All of us were looking at Ethan through our own particular lenses. You saw a patient with a stable condition. The specialist saw a medical mystery to solve. Mr. Crow saw a problem that money should be able to fix. I just happened to see a kid in pain because I wasn't looking for anything more complicated than that. Still, you saved him. You gave him something we'd all declared impossible. That deserves recognition, not investigation." Lena thought about the past 2 weeks, the awkward dynamic with staff who weren't sure how to treat someone who'd gone from housekeeper to some undefined role that apparently included challenging their billionaire employer and making decisions about his son's care. She'd felt the shift in how people looked at her, spoke to her, navigated around her presence. "I don't need recognition," she said. "I just need to know that Ethan's okay, that he's adjusting, that the people around him are actually seeing him instead of just managing him." Ms. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "He's doing better. The speech therapy is helping. His verbal communication improves every day. The hearing aid tolerance is increasing. He's starting to socialize with some kids from the tutoring program. All good signs." "And how does he seem? Emotionally?" The nurse smiled slightly. "Lighter. Like someone took weight off his shoulders. He laughs more, argues more, actually. He's developing opinions about his own care, and he's not afraid to voice them. It's—" She paused, searching for words. "It's like he's becoming more himself, instead of just being the patient we were all managing." That was what mattered, Lena thought. Not the medical miracle or the hearing percentage or any of the measurable outcomes that everyone wanted to quantify. Just a 13-year-old boy becoming more fully himself, more confident in his own voice and choices and presence in the world. "Thank you for telling me," Lena said. "And Ms. Rodriguez, we all do the best we can with what we know at the time. You didn't fail Ethan. The system failed him. The approach failed him. We just all need to do better going forward." The nurse's eyes glistened slightly. "Mr. Crow is lucky to have you here." "I'm the one who's lucky," Lena corrected. "I get to watch a family figure out how to actually be a family instead of just existing in the same expensive house together. That's something special." She left Miss Rodriguez in the hallway and finally made it to the small office off the laundry room where she could sit down and let the tears come. They weren't sad tears exactly, more like relief. The accumulated weight of 3 years of struggling to afford adequate care for her mother finally easing. Maria would have gardens, cultural programs, Spanish-speaking staff who would treat her like a person instead of a diagnosis. She'd have comfort and dignity in whatever time remained, regardless of whether she recognized the daughter who visited her every day. It was more than Lena had dared hope for, more than she'd thought possible, and it had come from the most unlikely source. A billionaire trying to learn how to be human, a man who'd failed his own son so badly that he was desperately attempting to not fail anyone else the same way. Lena pulled out her phone and called her sister, Rosa, who answered on the second ring. "Hey, is everything okay with Mama?" "She's fine, but I need to tell you about something. There's been a development." She explained about Heritage Gardens, about Julian's offer, about the medical trust that would cover Maria's care regardless of what happened with Lena's employment. Rosa listened in silence, and when Lena finished, there was a long pause before her sister spoke. "This is real? Not some trick or manipulation?" "I think it's real. I think he's genuinely trying to help." "And you trust him? This billionaire you've known for less than a month?" Lena thought about that question carefully. Trust was complicated. Julian was still learning how to not solve everything, still falling into old patterns, still struggling with the fundamental shift from control to acceptance. But his efforts seemed genuine. His recognition of his own failures seemed real. "I trust that he's trying," she said finally. I trust that he understands what he did wrong with his son and he's desperate not to repeat those mistakes. I trust that he sees helping Mama as a way to practice being someone different than who he's always been. That's a lot to trust based on a few weeks. I know, but Rosa, Heritage Gardens has sensory gardens, music therapy, Spanish-speaking staff who do cultural activities. Mama could tend plants again. She could have comfort and familiarity and dignity. Even if she doesn't remember us, she could have quality of life. Rosa's voice cracked slightly. I just don't want you to get hurt. Rich people make promises all the time and then change their minds when it's inconvenient. I know, but I think maybe sometimes you have to take the risk. Sometimes you have to trust that people can change, can be better, can use their resources for something other than control. Lena paused. And if I'm wrong, if this blows up in my face, at least Mama will have had some good months, some comfort, some dignity. That's worth the risk. They talked for a while longer, Rosa eventually agreeing to visit Heritage Gardens herself before they made any final decisions. When Lena hung up, she felt steadier, more certain that she was making the right choice even if it scared her. She returned to work, moving through the house, completing tasks that had become routine over the past weeks. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility and risk in equal measure. She'd crossed so many lines, professional boundaries, class barriers, the careful distance between employer and employee. There was no going back to simple housekeeping, no returning to invisible labor that kept her safely removed from the actual lives happening around her. She was entangled now, connected, vulnerable to consequences she couldn't control. And somehow, that felt exactly right. The day they moved Maria Morales to Heritage Gardens, the San Francisco fog rolled in thick and heavy, turning the world soft and indistinct. Lena rode in the transport van with her mother, holding Maria's hand while the older woman stared out the window at scenery she wouldn't remember 5 minutes from now. Where are we going, dear? Maria asked in Spanish, her accent still thick after 40 years in America. Somewhere beautiful, Mama, Lena answered, also in Spanish. Somewhere with gardens. I like gardens. I had a garden once, I think. Or maybe I dreamed that. You had a garden, behind our apartment on Mission Street. You grew tomatoes and peppers and herbs. You'd make me help you water them every morning before school. Maria's face brightened with something that might have been recognition or might have been the pleasure of a good story. That sounds nice. Was I a good gardener? The best, Mama. They arrived at Heritage Gardens just before noon. Rosa was already there, having taken the morning off from her job at the hospital to help with the transition. She stood in the lobby looking both hopeful and terrified, the same expression Lena saw in the mirror every morning lately. Dr. Winters met them personally, her calm competence immediately putting Maria at ease, even though the older woman had no idea who this stranger was or why she was being so kind. Mrs. Morales, welcome. We have your room already, and I thought we might take a walk through the gardens first. Would you like that? Maria nodded, always willing to trust people who spoke gently and moved slowly. They walked through the memory care wing together, Lena, Rosa, Maria, and Dr. Winters, while staff members smiled and introduced themselves and treated their new resident like she was someone important rather than someone to be managed. The room that would be Maria's was on the first floor with direct access to the gardens. Lena and Rosa had spent the previous day setting it up with photographs, Maria's favorite quilt, the rocking chair she'd brought from El Salvador 40 years ago. They'd created a space that felt like home, even though Maria probably wouldn't remember home anymore. It's nice here, Maria said, settling into her rocking chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd found something familiar. I think I could be happy here. Lena felt her throat tighten. Good, Mama. That's all I want. They left her there an hour later, Maria already absorbed in a craft activity with other residents, humming to herself as she folded paper into shapes she wouldn't remember making. Rosa cried in the parking lot, and Lena held her sister while they both processed the reality that this was the best they could do, give their mother comfort and dignity even if she couldn't remember who'd provided it. She seems content, Rosa said finally, wiping her eyes. That's something. It's everything, Lena corrected. She's safe and cared for and surrounded by beauty. Even if she doesn't remember us, she has quality of life. That's what matters. Rosa pulled back, studying her sister's face. You've changed since you started working for this family. You're, I don't know, less afraid maybe, more willing to ask for what you need. Lena thought about that assessment. A month ago, she would have never accepted help on this scale, would have worked herself to death rather than be vulnerable, rather than admit she couldn't handle everything alone. But watching Julian struggle to let go of control, watching Ethan fight for agency over his own life, it had taught her something about the difference between pride and dignity. I'm learning, she said simply, from some unexpected teachers. She returned to the estate that evening to find Ethan in the media room, hearing Aid out, absorbed in a book. He looked up when she entered, immediately reading something in her expression. How's your mom? He asked, signing as he spoke, a habit he'd developed that honored both his past and present relationship with sound. She's good. She's where she needs to be. Lena settled into a chair across from him. Thank you for convincing me to accept the help, for reminding me that sometimes what people need matters more than how it makes us feel about accepting it. Ethan grinned. I learned that from you. You did the same thing for me, focused on what I needed instead of what everyone else thought I should need. We make a good team. Yeah, we do. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, just existing in each other's presence, without the need to fill every moment with words or solutions or management. It was something Lena had learned in this house, that presence itself had value, that witnessing someone's experience without trying to fix it was its own form of care. Julian found them there 20 minutes later, standing in the doorway with an expression that was complicated and raw. Can I interrupt? You're already interrupting, Ethan pointed out, but there was affection in his voice rather than irritation. Julian stepped into the room, and Lena noticed he looked different somehow. Less rigidly controlled, more humanly uncertain. I wanted to check in, make sure the move went smoothly. It did. Your staff were incredibly helpful. Dr. Winters is exactly the kind of person I'd want caring for my mother. The facility is... Lena's voice caught slightly. It's more than I could have hoped for. Good. Julian nodded, then seemed to struggle with what to say next. I also wanted to talk to both of you about something, a decision I've made regarding the medical review. Lena tensed. He'd agreed to drop the investigation weeks ago, but billionaires change their minds when it suited them. Maybe he'd decided accountability mattered more than moving forward. Maybe the lawyers had convinced him there was money or justice or vindication to be pursued. I've established a foundation, Julian said, his words coming carefully like he'd rehearsed them. The Ethan Crow Foundation for Comprehensive Medical Care. Its mission is to provide free basic health screenings, including simple things like ear examinations, dental checks, vision tests, to families who can't afford regular preventive care, the kind of simple, basic attention that might have prevented 8 years of my son living in unnecessary silence. Ethan's eyes widened. Dad, let me finish. Julian's voice was rough with emotion. I spent 8 years and $23 million chasing complicated solutions while missing something simple. I'm not the only parent who's done that. I'm just the only one with enough money that the consequences of my blindness didn't compound into something worse. So instead of pursuing legal action against doctors who were doing what I hired them to do, specialized consultations rather than comprehensive care, I'm putting those resources toward prevention, toward making sure other families have access to the kind of basic care that notices problems before they become crises. Lena felt something shift in her chest. This was what transformation looked like. Not a billionaire proving he was right, but a father admitting he was wrong and trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes. The foundation will be run by people with actual medical expertise, Julian continued, but I'd like both of you to be involved in an advisory capacity. Ethan, because you understand what it's like to be the subject of expensive interventions that miss basic needs, and Lena, because you understand what it's like to notice suffering that everyone else overlooks. I'm not qualified, Lena started. You're exactly qualified, Julian interrupted. You're qualified by experience, by attention, by the willingness to act even when it's risky. That's worth more than credentials. Ethan was staring at his father with an expression of wonder. You're really doing this? Actually creating something positive instead of just being angry about what happened? I'm trying to, Julian said quietly. I'm trying to take the worst failure of my life and turn it into something that might help other people. I don't know if that's redemption or just management of guilt, but it feels like the right thing to do. It is perhaps the right thing, Ethan said firmly. It's exactly the right thing. Father and son looked at each other across the media room, and Lena witnessed something she'd been watching build for weeks finally crystallize into clarity. They were seeing each other, not as billionaire and patient, not as fixer and problem, but as two people bound by love and loss and the hard work of figuring out how to be family to each other. There's one more thing, Julian said, turning to Lena. I want to endow a chair at Heritage Gardens, the Maria Morales Chair for Culturally Responsive Alzheimer's Care. It would fund research and programming focused on serving immigrant communities, honoring cultural traditions, providing care that sees patients as whole people with rich histories rather than just diagnoses to manage. Lena couldn't speak, couldn't process the idea that her mother, Maria Morales, immigrant housekeeper, woman who'd cleaned other people's homes for 40 years, would have her name on something permanent, something that mattered, something that honored her humanity even as her own memory of that humanity faded. Why? She finally managed to ask. Because your mother raised someone who changed my son's life. Because immigrant women have been the backbone of domestic work in this country for generations, doing invisible labor that makes everyone else's lives possible, and they deserve recognition. Because, Julian's voice roughened, because I'm trying to learn how to use my resources for something other than control. And honoring your mother's legacy while she's still here to potentially benefit from the research seems like a good place to start. The tears came then, and Lena didn't try to stop them. She cried for her mother, for the gardens Maria would never remember but might still enjoy. She cried for Ethan, who'd found his voice in more ways than one. She cried for Julian, who was struggling every day to be someone different than who he'd been. And she cried for herself, for the unexpected gift of being seen and valued and trusted by people she'd never expected to matter to. Ethan crossed the room and hugged her, his thin arms surprisingly strong. Julian joined them a moment later, the three of them standing together in a constellation of shared grief and hope and transformation that none of them had seen coming. Thank you, Lena whispered when she could speak again, for seeing my mother, for seeing me, for being willing to change. Thank you, Julian said, for teaching me how. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Lena visited her mother every morning before work, spending an hour in Heritage Garden's sensory garden, while Maria pottered among the plants, and sometimes remembered that gardening was something she'd once loved. The staff learned Maria's preferences, her favorite songs, the stories from her childhood in El Salvador that still lived in her long-term memory even as the present slipped away. Some days Maria recognized Lena as her daughter. Most days she didn't. But she always seemed happy to have company, always smiled when Lena arrived, always held her hand like she knew this person was someone safe, even if the specifics escaped her. She's declining, Dr. Winters told Lena gently after one of their regular family meetings. The disease is progressing, but she's comfortable. She's engaged. She has quality of life. That's the best we can hope for at this stage. Lena nodded, accepting the reality she'd been living with for years. Her mother was leaving, one memory at a time. But she was leaving from a place of beauty and dignity rather than sterile warehousing. That mattered. At the estate, Ethan continued to adjust to hearing. His vocabulary expanded daily, his confidence growing as he learned to navigate conversations and distinguish sounds and participate in the hearing world in ways he'd never imagined possible. But he also learned to honor his need for silence, taking breaks when the noise became overwhelming, removing his hearing aid when he needed the peace of the quiet world he'd known for 8 years. It's weird, he told Lena one afternoon while they worked together in the kitchen. Him doing homework, her preparing dinner because the chef had the day off, and she'd discovered she missed cooking for people who appreciated it. I spent so long wanting to hear, and now that I can, I realize silence has its own value. Sound isn't better than silence. It's just different. That's wisdom, Lena said, chopping vegetables with the efficient precision of decades of kitchen work. Understanding that different doesn't mean better or worse, just different. I think, Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. I think I'm not deaf anymore, but I'm not really hearing either. I'm something in between, something that doesn't have a name yet. So name it yourself. Decide what it means to be you instead of letting medical definitions or other people's expectations do it for you. Ethan grinned. Is that what you did? When you decided to stop being invisible? I'm still learning how to not be invisible. It's harder than you'd think after decades of practice. Lena smiled. But yeah, I'm trying to name myself instead of accepting the names other people give me. Housekeeper, help, immigrant. Those are all true, but they're not complete. I'm also a daughter and a sister and someone who notices things and cares enough to act. Those matter too. Julian entered the kitchen then, drawn by the smell of cooking and the sound of conversation. He'd started doing that lately, gravitating toward wherever Ethan and Lena were, joining them instead of isolating in his office, learning to be present instead of productive. That smells incredible, he said, peering into the pot where Lena was making pozole, her mother's recipe from memory. It's Mama's recipe, or as close as I can get without her to correct me. Lena stirred the pot thoughtfully. She used to make this every Sunday. The whole apartment would smell like hominy and chili and comfort. Will you teach me? Julian asked suddenly. Both Lena and Ethan stared at him. Julian Crow, tech billionaire, asking to learn how to cook pozole in his own kitchen. You want to learn to cook? Ethan asked, not bothering to hide his surprise. I want to learn to do something with my hands that isn't typing or signing documents or managing crises. I want to... Julian struggled for words. I want to make something nourishing instead of just consuming or controlling or solving. Is that weird? It's growth, Lena said simply. And yes, I'll teach you, but you have to actually do the work. No delegating to the chef or having staff handle the prep. If you're going to learn, you're going to learn properly. Julian rolled up his sleeves. Deal. They spent the next hour working together in the kitchen. Lena teaching, Julian learning, Ethan providing commentary and stealing tastes when he thought no one was looking. It was domestic and ordinary and completely unlike anything that usually happened in the Crow estate, where meals were catered and prepared and served by professionals. But it was also profound in its ordinariness. A billionaire learning to chop onions from a housekeeper. A father cooking with his son. 3 people from completely different worlds finding connection in the simple act of making food together. My mother would have loved this, Lena said as they sat down to eat, the pozole rich and complex, and almost as good as Maria's version. Seeing her recipe being made in a kitchen like this, being shared with people who appreciate it. Tell me about her, Julian said, not her illness. Her. Who she was before the Alzheimer's. So Lena told stories about Maria crossing the border at 19, working 3 jobs while raising 2 daughters alone, building a life from nothing but determination and faith that her children would have opportunities she never had. About the garden and the cooking and the way Maria had made their tiny apartment feel like a palace through sheer force of love and attention. She sounds remarkable, Julian said when Lena finished. She was ordinary, Lena corrected gently. That's what made her remarkable. She didn't have money or power or resources. She just had love and determination and the willingness to work herself to exhaustion for her children. That's not unusual among immigrant women. That's just what they do, what we do. We build worlds out of nothing because our children deserve worlds. Julian was quiet for a long moment, processing this. I had every resource imaginable, and I still managed to fail my son for 8 years. Your mother had nothing and built something beautiful. You didn't fail Ethan, Lena said firmly. You loved him the only way you knew how. You're just learning different ways now. That's not failure. That's growth. She's right, Dad, Ethan added, his voice clear and certain. You weren't a bad father. You were just focused on the wrong things. But you're focusing on the right things now. That counts. Julian's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away from his son. I'm trying. Every day I'm trying to be someone who deserves you. You already deserve me. You're my dad. That's not something you earn. It just is. The simplicity of that statement, you're my dad, that just is, seemed to undo something in Julian. He stood abruptly, moved to where Ethan sat, and pulled his son into an embrace that looked like it was holding all the words he didn't know how to say. Lena quietly cleared the dishes, giving them privacy for this moment. But as she worked, she felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what she'd been brought here to witness and facilitate. Not medical miracles or hearing restoration, but the simple, profound work of a family learning to be family to each other. 3 months after Maria moved to Heritage Gardens, Lena arrived for her morning visit to find her mother sitting in the garden, eyes closed, face tilted toward the sun. She looked peaceful in a way Lena hadn't seen in years. "Mama?" Lena settled onto the bench beside her. Maria opened her eyes, turned to look at her daughter, and for the first time in 18 months, recognition flickered across her face. "Lena? Mi hija?" Lena's breath caught. "Yes, Mama, it's me. I had the strangest dream. I was lost somewhere, and I couldn't find my way home. But then I smelled tomatoes growing, and I knew if I followed that smell, you'd be there." Maria's voice was clear, present. The fog momentarily lifted. "You're always there, aren't you? Even when I can't remember, you're always there." "Always, Mama, I promise." Maria took her daughter's hand, studying her face with eyes that actually saw her. "You look tired, mija. Are you working too hard?" "I'm working just right, Mama. I have a good job. I'm helping people. You'd be proud." "I'm always proud of you, even when I forget everything else. I remember being proud of you." Maria's grip tightened slightly. "Thank you for the garden. It's beautiful here." Lena felt tears streaming down her face. "You're welcome, Mama. You deserve beautiful things." They sat together for 20 minutes while Maria remained present and lucid, talking about memories from Lena's childhood, asking about Rosa, commenting on the flowers blooming around them. Then, gradually, the clarity faded. Maria's eyes went distant again, the present slipping away like water through fingers. "It's nice here," Maria said, back to the pleasant confusion that was her normal state. "I think I could be happy here." "You are happy here, Mama. I can see it." Lena stayed until her mother dozed off in the sunshine, then returned to the estate with a heart that was simultaneously broken and healed. The moment of clarity had been a gift, unexpected, precious, temporary, but it had been real. Her mother had known her, had thanked her, had given her the permission to live her own life without guilt. She found Julian in his office, working through emails with the focused intensity of someone trying to change the world one decision at a time. He looked up when she knocked, and whatever he saw on her face made him immediately close his laptop. What happened? Lena told him about the morning, about the unexpected clarity, about her mother's gratitude for the garden and the beauty and the comfort. "She knew me, just for a few minutes, but she knew me. And she said thank you, for the garden, for being there, for—" her voice broke, "for not giving up even when she couldn't remember why it mattered." Julian came around his desk, did something he'd never done before, pulled Lena into a careful, respectful embrace. "I'm glad. I'm so glad you got that moment with her." "It's because of you," Lena said, pulling back to look at him. "Because you provided resources that gave her comfort and quality of life. Because you saw my mother as someone who mattered, even though you'd never met her. Because you—" She struggled for words. "Because you're learning how to use your power for something other than control." "I'm learning from the best teachers," Julian said simply. That evening, the Crow estate held something it had never hosted before, a small dinner party. Not the kind of formal entertaining Julian did for business purposes, but actual gathering of people who mattered personally. Rosa came with her partner and their daughter. Dr. Winters came from Heritage Gardens. Catherine Chen came with her husband. Ms. Rodriguez and Mr. Brennan came, hesitant but pleased to be included. And at the center of it all were Julian, Ethan, and Lena, the unlikely triangle of transformation that had changed all their lives. Ethan wore his hearing aid for the dinner, enjoying the chaos of conversation and laughter even when it overwhelmed him. He'd learned to excuse himself for quiet breaks when needed, returning refreshed rather than pushing through exhaustion to please everyone else. Julian had cooked, actually cooked with Lena supervising, a meal that was simple but made with care. Pozole and rice and tortillas served family style around the kitchen table instead of the formal dining room, because this wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about sharing. "I want to make a toast," Julian said when everyone was settled. He stood, raising his glass, looking uncomfortable but determined. 3 months ago, my life changed because someone I'd hired to clean floors did something remarkable. She noticed my son was in pain, and she helped him. Not because she expected reward, not because it was her job, but because she couldn't stand watching someone suffer when she had the power to act. Lena started to object, but Julian held up his hand. Let me finish. What I've learned since then is that power doesn't come from money or resources or the ability to solve problems. Real power comes from paying attention, from seeing people as humans instead of projects, from being willing to step outside comfortable boundaries because someone needs help and you have the capacity to provide it. He looked directly at Lena. You taught me that. You taught all of us that. And I'm grateful beyond words. To Lena, Ethan added, raising his own glass, who sees people. To Lena, the table echoed, glasses raised. Lena felt her face flush, uncomfortable with the attention, but also deeply moved by it. I just did what anyone should do, what everyone should do, notice suffering and act on it. That's exactly the point, Rosa said, her voice thick with emotion. Everyone should, but they don't. You did, and it changed everything. The dinner continued with warmth and laughter and the kind of connection that money couldn't buy, but creating space for humanity could facilitate. People told stories, shared struggles, admitted failures, and celebrated growth. It was messy and imperfect and absolutely real. Later, after the guests had left and the kitchen was cleaned, Lena found Ethan on the back terrace, hearing Aid out, enjoying the silence of the night. She sat beside him, and they watched the bay together without speaking. Finally, Ethan signed to her, "Thank you for everything. You've already thanked me many times. I mean for more than the ear thing. Thank you for teaching my dad how to be a father. Thank you for showing me it's okay to need silence sometimes. Thank you for being someone who stayed even when it was complicated." Lena felt her throat tighten. "You're easy to stay for, kid. You're going to do remarkable things with your life." "So are you," Ethan signed back. "You already have." They sat together in comfortable silence. Two people from completely different worlds who'd found unexpected connection through the simple act of one person noticing another's pain and choosing to help. Inside, Julian stood at his office window, watching them on the terrace. He thought about the man he'd been 3 months ago, isolated, controlling, convinced that every problem had a solution if you threw enough money and determination at it. He thought about the 8 years he'd spent trying to fix his son instead of actually seeing him. And he thought about the woman who'd walked into his house with nothing but attention and compassion and the willingness to act, and changed absolutely everything. His phone buzzed with an email from Catherine. The Ethan Crow Foundation had been formally established. The Maria Morales chair had been endowed. Legal documentation was complete, resources allocated, programs ready to launch. Everything he'd promised was now real and permanent. Julian typed a response. "Thank you. Let's make sure this actually helps people instead of just making us feel good about helping people." The difference matters. He thought Catherine would appreciate the distinction. He'd learned it from Lena, after all, the difference between solving problems to feel better about yourself and actually addressing human needs, because humans deserve dignity. The foundation would screen thousands of children every year, catching simple problems before they became expensive crises. The endowed chair would fund research that honored cultural traditions and saw patients as whole people. It wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't give him back the 8 years of his son's voice he'd missed. But it would mean that other families might not have to experience what his family had gone through. And that, Julian was learning, was what redemption actually looked like. Not erasing failure, but transforming it into something that prevented future failures. He watched Lena and Ethan on the terrace, their easy companionship a testament to the power of simply being seen and valued. He thought about Maria in her garden, sometimes remembering and sometimes not, but always surrounded by beauty and dignity. He thought about his own slow transformation from billionaire problem solver to father, learning how to just be present. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a dramatic solution or expensive intervention or a thing that could be measured and quantified and controlled. It was just humans learning how to be human together, how to notice each other's suffering, how to act with compassion even when it was risky, how to accept help without shame and offer it without expectation, how to love each other not despite complexity but because of it. The estate, which had felt like a museum of wealth for so long, now felt like a home. Not perfect, not solved, but alive with the messy, complicated, beautiful work of people figuring out how to matter to each other. Julian turned away from the window and headed toward the terrace. He had a son to talk to, a woman to thank again for saving both of them, and a life to live that was finally about more than just solving the next problem. He'd spent his whole life building empires. Now he was learning to build something that actually mattered: connection, presence, love, that saw people instead of trying to fix them. It was the hardest work he'd ever done, and somehow the most important. On the terrace, Ethan looked up as his father approached. Julian sat down beside them, the three of them forming a small constellation against the San Francisco night. No one spoke. No one needed to. They just sat together, witnessing each other's existence, being present to each other's humanity. And somewhere in Marin County, Maria Morales slept peacefully in a room filled with photographs of a daughter she might not remember tomorrow, but whose love surrounded her like the most permanent thing in the world. Because some things, Lena had learned, transcended memory. Love persisted even when recognition faded. Care mattered even when it couldn't solve the underlying problem. Presence was its own form of healing, not because it eliminated suffering, but because it witnessed suffering with compassion and refused to look away. The billionaire had learned to be human. The housekeeper had learned to be visible. The deaf boy had learned he could be both silent and heard, that his value didn't depend on functioning like everyone else. And a woman losing her memory to Alzheimer's spent her final years surrounded by gardens and dignity, honored by a foundation bearing her name, loved by daughters who showed up every day regardless of whether she remembered them. That was the real miracle. Not the hearing restored or the blockage removed or the expensive interventions that money could buy. Just humans choosing to see each other, to matter to each other, to build worlds out of attention and compassion and the willingness to stay present even when presence was all they had to offer. It was ordinary. It was profound. It was everything that actually mattered in the end. And it started with one person noticing another's pain and refusing to look away. Everything else, all the transformation that followed, was just the natural consequence of that single act of courage. The courage to see, the courage to care, the courage to act, the courage to be human in a world that constantly tried to reduce people to problems waiting to be solved. That was the story. That was always the story. And it was just beginning.